All right, it's ready. Just waiting for Nate to come back. He's going to help with the introduction. Good. So we'll do it for social media. Good morning, Chris.
Brady?
Hey, Brady.
Hey,
How you doing?
Good. Securian, I know you've worked with us before.
Yes,
so
yeah, post security.
Heard about you from Brandon?
Yes, it's been a minute.
So excited to see this.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Thanks for attending.
Yeah, of course.
All right. Give it 2 more minutes and I'll have Lauren close the door for us and then get started. These are much cozier than they were before COVID. These rooms.
Nobody's been sitting on them.
I think they remodeled
They're brand new.
these. I think they remodeled them a year or 2 ago.
Okay.
Because it used to be very no character in the rooms. So like Lauren wouldn't have been able to sit on a nice ottoman chair.
Like all the like faux artwork too.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how much.
And they built the shelf, I think, just for the little poster.
Who drew the transcript on?
Yeah.
Nice.
Got it ready.
Is that Teams Premium?
What's that?
Is that Teams Premium?
No.
No.
No, just regular Teams.
Oh, okay.
No smart.
Intelligent recap of our event.
Yeah, we'll have to do that a old fashioned way. Actually go through and read it in a document. Right. All right. Lauren, would you do the honors of shutting the door for us? And I'm sorry, Nathan, that I didn't get an updated intro slide with you on there.
It's all right.
Before we post it up to Session Eyes, I'll get an updated
It's
one.
probably my fault.
No, I doubt it. We'll blame Teresa.
The person checking everyone in.
That's right. She's busy working. So thank you all for sitting in this intimate setting. I like this. This is nice. It's better than sitting or standing in front of a room. This, we'll be able to get into some of the Q&A a little bit more in this style, I feel. Chris Blackburn, a solution architect at Concurrency, been here for almost 8 years in July. Been in the Microsoft consulting space for 22 years. So it's over half my life, I could say at this point, has been working in the Microsoft space. And then with me right now is Nathan. So I'll have to turn the camera just for the sake of posterity in this recording. We'll give the room a quick introduction to yourself, Nathan.
Sure. I think I have a.
There we go.
Cool. So I'm Nathan Lasnowski. I'm Concurrency's Chief Technology Officer. We've been working together for those 7 years. I've been with Concurrency for 21. I have been I've been in Microsoft tech for about as long, but as you know, like it's changed in every couple of years, it turns into something completely different. Been a Microsoft MVP for 13 years, so that's been a little thing I've hung my hat on and changed as well. I started off as a Hyper-V MVP, if you believe it, and then moved into Azure just recently. So that's kind of transitioned over time. Got 8 kids, a beautiful, like 17-year-old that's looking at tech. So I've got to really enjoy her exploring what it means to be a person who's interested in like IT and development and AI and what's right for her, and that's been pretty cool. And then I have a 1.5-year-old. My kids are really active. I'm pretty active doing Ironman races and triathlons, and they've gotten into that as well, which has been a interesting experience for me because now my daughter's trying to beat me. So that's been fun. That's her holding the first place cup from this event that we did. I happened to beat her in that one by 46 seconds, so I'm going to hang that hat until this upcoming race. She's just tremendously faster swimmer than I am. And I think just one of the things I've learned through the years of being involved in IT and competitive sports and stuff is that there's always someone faster than you and there's always someone smarter than you. The person smarter than me is sitting right next to me.
Just more in the weeds.
Yeah,
Just more in the weeds.
But we all have our own perspectives to share. So I think this is a really cool setting for us to maybe share the perspective that we've experienced, the battle scars of M&A.
Oh my gosh.
But also probably hear some things that you guys have gone through too, and make this something where hopefully we leave this session with some more learnings as well. And then Lauren, man, Lauren's going to have some things to share as well. So nice to meet everybody.
And your doodle, what's your doodle's name?
Jazzy.
Jazzy.
Yeah.
Kind of blends in with the ground there. You look really close.
Yeah, she didn't want to sit up for that, and she had gotten the cut of shame at that point because she had gotten some mats and we're like, oh shoot, so we had to shave her down, and nobody was happy about that move, but it worked out.
Awesome. Thanks for that intro, Nathan. And about myself, kind of covered it a little bit. When I'm not behind the keyboard, I'm into electronic music and DJing and traveling the world, and be doing a little bit of that this summer. So excited for that. Got my blog that I've been maintaining since I think 2003. One of my most popular blogs was how to use a VB script to get your Windows XP registry or your activation key, your product key. It probably still get hits. It's really surprising. So check it out. I try to add some content in my LinkedIn. So leave that there for you all. And then really we'll dive into the overview. M&As, it is probably the most complex. If you're in IT, it is the most complex project you can do, because not only does it put wear and tear on not only your organization, but the organization you're acquiring, your IT team, your partners you work with. So having that foundation even before, and if you have that opportunity before those two companies sign on the dotted lines, you're way ahead of the game. A lot of these organizations that we come into, they have a deadline that they're trying to meet, and their leadership has told them they want something done, but at this point they have no clue how to do it or where to even start. And so that was really the foundation of this whole session, and a lot of the material that's in the session, we go in and we talk to different companies to help them understand what some of those tools and tricks are to be successful. It's not without pain, but if you can minimize the pain and quantify the pain beforehand, then it makes it a little more tolerable. And so that's the goal of this session. And so we're here to share some of the battle stories and some of the successes over some of those M&A projects that we've done over the last 5 years. First one was good old Merrill.
Oh, yeah, even before that, we did Johnson Controls.
Yeah.
Three Johnson Controls conversions, and they've all got these battle scar learnings from them, and it's I'm excited to just have some time to unpack this with everybody, because I mean these are always like the best projects, but also the most like tense projects that we do, because there's so much pressure from the customer, so much pressure from like the leadership within the organizations. There's these two companies coming together or splitting up, and the extent to which you have your stuff together as you go about this journey really is a determinant of how well this goes. I sometimes I tell the team, or we talk about how like these projects either go quietly well or they're train wrecks.
Yeah.
Like the quietly well is kind of where you want to be here.
Right.
Like nobody's making new dollars off of this direct project, but it affects their ability to make new dollars or to be operationally capable, and that's really what I'll talk about in a bit here.
So why don't you go ahead and jump right in? Well, we'll after we do a quick little overview of the segment. So, really the what, why, how, and where that Nathan will cover. And then I'll jump into probably one of the two larger sessions. So we might not stick to exactly 30 minutes for that one, but I want to just forewarn you that that one is one of the biggest ones, because that's really where you have that vision of the direction of where you're going to go with all the planning. Because with any successful project, it all boils down to successful planning and forethought. So we'll do that in segment 2. Some project success, organizational change management. We'll kind of talk about that readiness. We'll bring Lauren up to kind of talk about, I'm not even going to bring you up. You can just sit from there. That'll just be fine. You can, I'll just directionally change the laptop so it can pick it up in Teams. Tool set, that really over the last, and you could probably speak to the Johnson Controls project, some of those tool sets didn't really exist back then that we have today. And so the ones that are in place now, the ones that are SaaS-based, really make it night and day difference in being able to execute on these projects. We'll touch a little bit about where, and that's just forewarning, that's probably the second largest session that we'll kind of cover over. And then the 5th and 6th really just kind of talk about how you can really prepare leadership to understand how big these are, how stressful they can be, as we talked about. Going in there and setting the ground rules with leadership to let them know that if they want this done in 5 weeks, how deep is their wallet to go, and how many people can they put on it? Because that's with any project that we deal with in consulting. Anything can get done. It's just a matter of how many digits and how many people are tied to that project. And then the future. What do we see as the future in these projects? How can we take planning? How can we take the tools and really streamline them into one solid direction? And we'll talk about some of the cool things that we're doing in concurrency to do that. So I'm going to break these up into 6 different segments, and we're going to have a Q&A session at the end of those. Happy to engage during those Q&As. If you want to get up, go grab a drink, go to the restroom, stretch your legs, whatever, feel free to do so in those. Sound good? All right, fire away.
Sure. Let's talk about the why. So who's been through an M&A before? Okay. Yeah, so some of you. Okay. So M&As, I mean, let's just talk about the why people do M&As for a second here. So you have a business, you're either trying to consume another organization into your organization in a very like subset sort of way. You're either spinning it off, you're carving it off, you're combining things together. There's a lot of flavors to this. So I thought we'd start by just even kind of talking about what we're talking about here. So when you say M&A, a lot of people have like these frameworks that go through their mind of what they may have experienced in the past. So here's 4 different examples that we might be experiencing as you go through an M&A. So the first one on the left-hand side would be a divestiture. So divestiture is where one company decides to completely spin off of an existing company. So this is really one of the more interesting opportunities, because in divestitures, you have an organization that is essentially becoming a new company in and of itself for the purposes of increasing share value across both companies. So an example of this is we did a divestiture for Brunswick Corporation. You may know them by like Sea Ray, Mercury, bowling balls, things like that. So they used to own this company called Life Fitness, which is a like
You
a
go to any
workout.
Lifetime, you know exactly what they are.
Exactly, like a workout machine company, right? Competes against the Pelotons of the world, except it's a little bit higher grade. So they were one company, and Brunswick said, "Look, we believe that we actually have two companies here that are not complementary to each other." And you kind of wonder why they even hold the bowling ball company at one point, right? Like boats and bowling balls, that doesn't really go together either. But like they're not complementary. We want to scale these businesses independently of each other because we believe that's the best way to increase shareholder value. So they made a decision to spin off Life Fitness into its own organization. And that was a really interesting opportunity for both Brunswick, the boating company, and Life Fitness, the workout machine company, because when you engage in that kind of project, one of them's kind of left holding the bag of the old organization. And that's the same thing with the sort of data site Merrill situation. Neither company wanted to be left with the old stuff. Both looked at that opportunity and said, hey, I get to build an entire new environment from the ground up. This is really rock star awesome. I want to have this opportunity for myself. So in the case of Brunswick, both of the Life Fitness basically got the opportunity to spin up its whole independent organization, but Brunswick also took that opportunity to do an excessive modernization effort. So even though one of them really got the opportunity to spin up an entirely new AD and new, cloud Azure environment and to migrate to it, it facilitated both organizations being able to modernize. One of the things that's really important in this type of integration, or disintegration, I guess would be a better way to say it, is organization one wants to continue operating as they've been operating. Brunswick leadership theoretically doesn't care about IT because they're just going to keep being Brunswick, right? What they care about is getting this organization off of them and then devolving the temporary service agreements, the TSAs, over that period of time. So there's even after the kind of primary elements of the M&A are completed, the divestiture are completed, you have these temporary agreements that exist for like applications and the sort of hanging chads that exist across this environment that take a little while for them to unravel and pull apart. That's oftentimes like the ERP system or the financial systems that like take a while for them to unravel.
With a SharePoint namespace.
Exactly, it's still there, right? Yeah, that's funny.
The old company with one of them we were talking about, that was one that we did in 2019, and the old company still has the licensed name of the SpinCo is their SharePoint, and so that's one project that we're talking with them, and they understand that that's really those projects are more organizational change management, but it's been extended out 4 years now, and they still are trying to get rid of it. And there's going to be that line in the sand where that company is going to be like, you're done. You need to sign off that you no longer hold any rights to our name. So it's another interesting twist.
Totally. That can be an interesting part of the journey too. It's just getting rid of some of the old stuff, even when you migrate it, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the migration. It's fascinating. So this is one of the more straightforward situations because you're literally spinning it off into a new organization. The challenges here come with like selecting a name, spinning up an Office 365 tenant, getting a new relationship with Microsoft. All of that is essentially meaningless to the parent organization who just wants it done, right? I think the thing that we always experience in this is customers always underestimate how complicated it is, how much time it takes, and how expensive it is to do M&As.
Yes.
Especially SpinCo, where you're literally building a new company. Like you're all the stuff they've invested over the years in building up a new IT organization, like you're now going to do that from the ground up again.
It's exciting, but it's scary.
It is. And I guess the benefit of it is you do get to do it it's like you get to have your dream scenario, right? If I got to build this again from the ground up, that's what that scenario affords you. So that's sort of scenario one. Scenario two would be this sort of carve out idea. So what exactly is a carve out? A carve out is this idea that like you are acquiring like this sub element of this other organization into you. It tends to be one we run into less often. It's like, I want your little piece and I'm going to suck that into me. And it's less about people integration. It's more about like a piece of IP or an element of a SaaS business or something that you're pulling in. And in that case, you're you're essentially looking to get the value of the thing that you're moving in and optimize that intake into the greater application organization. So like where we've run into this has been like you have a business that is more of a SaaS company and then eats up this other like database company and it wants to integrate their products together. Or you'll notice it like, remember when like Quest bought Binary Tree?
Yeah.
Like that's essentially an example of that.
The biggest consumer of that model is we're actually sitting in their space, Microsoft.
Yeah.
If you go Google, there's actually a Wikipedia page of all Microsoft's acquisitions over the 40 years or so they've been in business. It's phenomenal. It's huge.
A lot of times this is more about acquiring the business than it is about acquiring the people or the tech. So like we just worked with a company that are a healthcare consulting organization, and they bought a company that does like a subset of that as a service. They have like a tool, it's one developer. They bought essentially that business's customers to eventually take that piece of software, throw it aside, integrate that into their core offering. So they're buying the revenue, they're buying the relationship, they're buying the name and the experience, but they're not really buying the product itself per se. They're buying the data and the like revenue relationship. So in that case, there's a lot less work per se on the M365 side. It's more on the data side and the app side. So this next one is what most of our M&As look like. So this is the full company acquisition state. And the core value statement here is you're trying to reduce time to value of the organizations working together cohesively. And that can start very early on simply by even letting organizations share calendars and communicate with each other and have a Teams namespace. Even simple things like that create a game-changing experience for these organizations to work with each other. And that's what I think M365 has done. You know, if we compare that against like where we were like 10 years ago, people email and jump back and
Even
forth.
2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, totally. So I think that's really interesting. This company acquisition approach is really about how do I take these two organizations and make them act as one. And this is really where that sort of missed expectations tends to come into play. And we have some slides on that later, so I won't spoil it, but it's really about like setting the tone of what this actually takes to get done and making sure that you understand what's critical. Like we had a conversion we were doing in this case where they're literally announcing a new name. So they're acquiring one, they're merging together, but they're one was essentially acquired by the other, but even as a conjunction of that, they're announcing a new name. There's a date on that. Like we have to figure out how to meet that date. So this is very common. Like you get into this M&A activity, they have goals that are bigger than IT about how they want to produce themselves to the market, how they want to present the overall organization, how they want to be viewed. And all of that has a timeline attached to it. And a lot of times it's an unrealistic timeline and you have very little ability to push back.
Yeah.
So you end up having these like conversations about like, what are you willing to compromise to make that happen? What part of the user experience are you willing to compromise to make that happen? And sometimes those choices are ones that do allow you to have them make changes because once you give them the A and the B, they are like, oh, well, okay, I don't want B, so I'm going to accept A, and maybe that moves me back 2 weeks. And you realize it's not quite that date may not be quite as important as you thought they originally thought it was. Sometimes it's immovable. You're just like, we have a new email address on this day, and that's the only thing that we care about.
That was the most recent scenario, and C-suite's idea is everything now is coming out as this domain name. But then once you start to boil reality up, it's okay, humans that live in both organizations can send out. And then we're going to kind of tail on things like emailing out from certain business functions, shared mailboxes, distribution groups. Once we were able to boil that up and let them know these are two very complex efforts. We can get one done, but we need to still do some due diligence on the other one. That's kind of where one of those compromises come into play, where it's not just 30 days now. Okay, now it's 45, 60, 75, where all of it then now is able to email out as this new domain, because not people can email out, but then once you start to figure out what parts of your business that run it need to email out and what has to change in code, what has to change in applications, find the right application owners, then it's a whole spider web of dependencies that you have to start to uncover.
Totally. This one thing that might be a little bit off about this graphic is that A tends to be a lot bigger than B. Like this is it's a little bit of a misnomer. Like we've had cases where they are like pretty close in size, but most of the time A is drastically bigger than B or significantly bigger than B. And so like we did Rockwell's last 4 M&As, and you know, you're talking about like what, a 20,000 user organization, and then like all the acquisitions are like
300, 500, 700.
Exactly. And it's meaningful to them,
Yep.
but ultimately they're basically getting sucked into the IT organization of Rockwell. Like, kiss your stuff goodbye. Here's our new standard. This is what we're doing, etc. And you have a path forward. Now, when they're closer in size, you get more similar to the right-hand side, the merger of equals. But I want to specifically lay that to the side for a second, because even when they're closer in size, you're usually selecting one of the organizations you're getting intaked into. Like, we just did this one, and they're pretty close. Like, you got like a 5,000 and like a 4,000, right? And they had to kind of pick which one actually did the acquiring. Wasn't truly a merger. Someone's got the boss here, you know, and you're still moving into one of those spots, which oftentimes, you know, there's a power struggle and who bought who and all that stuff. But you're old, and sometimes one organization that's being brought into the new one may actually have better IT functions. Like in this case, like one of them is really well Azure governed in Azure. The one that they're moving into is not. It's like, well, shoot,
There's a long road ahead.
yeah. So that's the state. The far right side is like, we've had so many conversations where when you have similar sized organizations, their first thought is, well, let's do the A thought.
Let's do a greenfield.
Yeah, greenfield, until you show them what that costs. And, you know, sometimes you're like, man, I really wish we could have done that. But that ends up being something where, like, it's pretty rare that companies actually do greenfield, just because you have to start over with everything. Unfortunately, like, I would really love to do that in a lot of these cases.
That's why you have those shows on HGTV. You know, they just gut out the house and they do the inside, because to build a new one is probably 2 or 3 times the cost. So same concept. It's easier to move into something and remodel it than it is to build brand new.
Exactly.
The CRM and financials drive a lot of that, right? Those systems are
They can.
the longer tooth in most cases, or not always.
Not always.
Okay.
Even in some cases, in this most recent example where it's the merger of equals coming into one tenant, as we mentioned, the Azure was less governed, the Workday was less governed, the onboarding was less governed, but somehow, you know, they had to decide, and we gave them those 3 options: move into A, move into B, or both A and B move into C. And then they saw C was way too expensive, and they said, okay, we're going to pick A. So in a lot of cases, you know, the app landscape doesn't necessarily drive the decision. It's some sort of decision at the top. It's the C-levels talking, you know, which one's going to go into where.
Yeah. That's the TSA too. A lot of times, that last part, and we can show you the phases later. But like, that's like the phase 3 spot, you know, where you're just like, over time we're going to move these apps over, and tends to be like the afterthought. It's super important, but like tends to be the thing that like isn't day one. Doesn't tend to drive like what actually happens there.
Have you had where the apps actually are driving your deadline? Because we had one where like they were doing SAP cutover, so all the IT infrastructure had to also cut on that same day. So that was driving that, and also with the TSA regulations and also the penalties for not doing it, also then pushed that at that same time.
Totally, yeah. The Brunswick one was similar to that, where like they had some TSAs for like some apps, but like they had a go live on their ERP platform on a certain day, and the things that surrounded it needed to be live and migrated. Like we migrated both Life Fitness and Brunswick to Azure in their own new tenants. Then they had another partner building up their OCI infrastructure to create the, you know, new Oracle instance there and blah blah blah. But But yeah, there was dates that they had to track against. for
Yeah,
sure.
we had 250 in TSA, and each one had a date to it. That was fun.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
All right. Cool. So, you may be familiar with like the steps of M&A, but this I think is an interesting way to think about it. Where you get involved is always interesting. Way at the front end here, what happens is there's this like time in the M&A process where very few people know that this is even a thing. And even maybe phase 0 is like the CEO talking with another CEO or some kind of board conversation about we want to go acquire companies that look like this. And there might be like several in the market that they're going to think about. And that's even just a strategic conversation that like we're interested in M&A, and they identify some, they start having conversations, and some fall apart pretty early. Once you get to a point where you're like, I've identified company X, and company X looks like an organization that's complementary to my business, or I want to split off company Y. Let's just focus for this conversation. Let's just focus on acquiring M&A for example, for this. So I've identified that. There's this integration and value assessment happening that occurs, which is like due diligence. It's really weak on the IT side.
Yeah.
Like very few organizations have
sometimes
strong due
non-existent,
diligence. Yeah,
definitely.
it's non-existent, exactly. Even ones that have like an M&A department, they tend to not even know that the M&A is happening until after like the week due diligence has been done. Because oftentimes you have like an external company doing that due diligence. So phase 1, I think I would even say is like very, very, very small room. You're talking about, and then once you do get to maybe talk to someone, the decision's all been made. You're in a let's just get to know them and try to understand what the heck's going on over there. Like, is it a cluster? Is it not? A spot. And largely, you're going to get involved at the phase 2, which is the sort of pre-close planning spot where they've made a decision and intent to do it. And now they're in you can have a conversation with them stage because we've announced it publicly or we've talked about it in some kind of context. And at that spot, you have like companies that have an M&A organization or they've developed their playbook, they can have like something they send to them, right? It's like, I want this information from you. And there's a term, secure the asset. Usually the acquirer has the right to do that. So that's where like phase 2.5 is like, you've said this, like go deploy your security suite like across their environment, right?
Do some cybersecurity assessments at that point in time. When it's going to happen. It may not have been fully closed, but you have that opportunity from IT to drive those types of cybersecurity assessments.
Yeah, like this is 100% where, I mean, how many situations have we been in where like the acquired company is totally compromised or gets compromised, and like keep that thing in a box,
Yeah, the high risk, right? And you don't want to go buy a company and all of a sudden, surprise, you're in the news because of that risk that you didn't know about. So you want to make sure that you keep that at zero as much as you can.
So in phase 2, right at the edge of that, you tend to be putting together like what we usually do is we do like a planning project. Like sometimes we don't have the opportunity to do that, but usually you're dropping a planning project so you can get everybody organized around your options. Frankly, like people just don't trust your options until you really open up the box and can tell them exactly what they understand that you understand, sort of thing. So you get through that, and then you have this phase 3, that's kind of where like your planning starts, honestly. Like that's your planning project, and then you go into that like I want email. Like that's always the first thing.
That phase 3 is kind of what we'll talk about in the next session. You can dig under the hood for kind of first 180 days, kind of what to expect.
Yeah. And then you have integration execution, which we'll break down into sub phases, which is like a lot of extra. Think about it as little boxes that can get stacked or done concurrently, depending on what you're trying to do.
Legos spilled up.
Exactly. And then very few companies actually like do a retro. I mean, like at the end of phase 4 and the beginning of phase 5 is like where it gets really dicey. Like every project at the end, I feel like we just want to be done.
Right.
Like but that's how everybody feels because these are stressful and they take a lot of effort and there's weekends and nights and everybody's gotten crunchy with each other and you're like, it's just there's no like I've never found in a like maybe some of the small ones, but like most of the big ones, it's like they kind of inevitably get like, oh, like can we finally be done with this stupid thing? And you got like these hanging users that haven't migrated yet.
Devices or apps or servers or files. Usually what happens.
Yeah, it's just part of the M&A process, right? So, and then throughout all this, they're trying to integrate businesses. They have these retention agreements with certain people and not with others, and people quit, and you've got all this stuff going on, right? That happens as you merge these companies together. Figure out who's new job. Everybody's stressed about their jobs. So in between all this is all this like org tension of like people feeling, having their own sort of, so having emotional awareness, I think through that is important. It's that like people don't want to be jerks to you. Like they're just stressed out. So.
The crunchy term, that's the one to remember.
Yeah. So these would be the things that like, if you had to back up a second and just say like, okay, I know I live in IT, but IT is not the center of the universe in the context of M&A, with the exception of maybe their email. I want you to maybe think about these things that the company's trying to achieve, just in general. The number one thing you're trying to do, if you had to like measure an M&A in a business-centric term and say like, the reason I'm doing this project is to achieve something, it's to reduce the time to value of the integration. Like if I can integrate them faster and as a result, allow them to gain efficiencies quicker to get their business strategy enacted in a more rapid period of time, that is what we're trying to do with the technology integration element. So always keep that as a core goal. Where I think people miss is they put 2 in front of 1. They'll think, like we had a customer of ours who remained nameless say something like,
do no harm,
right? That was his term, do no harm. And I love this guy. I think he's awesome. He's a wonderful person. But I think in retrospect, even he would have taken a different approach to the project based upon that statement. Because sometimes what people think of as do no harm, and we'll go into this later, I don't want to we keep getting to things where we want to open up the box. So just leave the box on the table. Like, it's one of those things where, yes, interrupting production is a critical thing. Doing no harm is different than that. And sometimes the choices that reduce time to value of integration are choices that require a hard choice now in order to get an easy integration versus an easy choice now, less friction for the business decision, but a really dicey, crunchy integration that never really feels to anyone like it was satisfying. So those two are an interesting balance of like 1 and 2 or 2 and 1. I'd say always put 1 in front of 2, understanding that 2 is, what do we mean when we talk about interruption? Like, am I building the product here, or am I just like changing the experience on the person's device? So that's a interesting relationship. The third kind of goes along with it, which is this mitigation of security risks. Chris and I are involved in a remediation right now. A company called us up. We had never worked with them before. They're like a friend of a friend of a friend of the president of our company, and they've been completely owned, right? Like everything in their environment has been owned. Like when you find an organization that's been in that state, like, man, you wish all these other things you would have made choices on earlier.
Except the stuff they had in their cloud.
True. Yes.
Yeah.
That's what saved them.
Yeah.
Right? They had hybrid enabled.
All the stuff that was hybrid, just like, but the stuff that they had in Azure and their email and everything, they're still able to work. Their production data center that they work with their customers is still up and running. It's just all the back office is just, it's been in disarray the last week.
Totally. So mitigating security risks, key. Modernizing the environment. If I had to give you like one like side tip to like carry with you through M&As, it's, there's this saying like, don't let a good crisis go to waste. Don't let a good M&A go to waste.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is a wonderful opportunity for you to modernize. the organization that's being intaked, both organizations, like that one where Brunswick and Life Fitness spun off, you get money. Like there's money to do stuff. Like use that opportunity to modernize where you want these organizations to go, and versus make that project drag along for the next 10 years. Like do it now. So think about where you want that destination to be and modernize to it. I'll talk about that in a second. And then gain efficiencies, which is really the end goal. Like they're integrating these organizations to gain efficiencies, and because they believe sometimes this is the right choice and sometimes it's not right, but they believe that by organization 1 and organization 2 coming together, that they will increase the value of both organizations together more than they will apart, right? And divestiture is different, right? Like divestiture is, I believe that a exercise equipment company and a boating company will gain more value separate than they will together. So like that's really the end goal, right? They're trying to increase shareholder value. So gaining efficiencies either together or apart is really at the end of the story what you're trying to achieve. So things to complement, things to think about when you're looking at your M&A and want to complement it with your technology strategy. The most successful ones we've done have modernized during integration. Like that has been like example, deploy cloud-only PCs. Like just do it. Like stop with this
convoluted workflow of keeping wallpapers and icons in the same place on machines, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the next session. But it's short-term pain or long-term gain. It's like
exactly. The next here is, in order to modernize, you need to understand where you're taking your architecture. Like you need to have the plan understood of what your goal is. So like if you don't know that, like a lot of times, like we get in and we'll be like cloud PC is a thing, and they like sometimes they're already on their way there and they understand. Sometimes they don't, and they don't trust it. Like they don't trust it, or they've been trying and failing, so they don't want to go toward it. Where you're like, shoot, like
almost there. The finish line's right there.
Exactly. Like this company that just got hacked, we are literally rolling out cloud PCs now. Like we're not taking 5 years to do it, 2 weeks to do it, or even months to do it. Like we're just doing it. Like, and that is going to be a simpler approach. It's going to be more secure. Like it's easier to manage, all those things. And you can say, well, what about my GPOs and what about this and what about that? Like, well, screw it. You just, this company just got hacked. Now they're just deploying new, and they're not worried about all that stupid stuff anymore, right?
So the simpler is better sometimes.
Exactly. So plan the M&A approach that tops the end game technology, and then as a component of that architecture. And then one thing I would convey, and this is counterintuitive, but retaining the legacy approach tends to actually be slower. Like sometimes the scaling might not be faster for people, but the actual conversion approach is going to be faster by adopting modern approaches rather than trying to drag along the legacy stuff into the new environment, which is, people don't usually take that approach. They think, I want my PC to look exactly what it was, or I want my data center to look like I'm going to migrate my stuff to another VM or a cluster. Well, like I can move it to Azure faster than you can do that actually. Like this is an opportunity for you to really look at that end game and adopt it and know that it doesn't slow you down. It actually speeds you up. So,
what do you guys find is your balance between doing a modernization versus doing like a fast and functional approach? Because like there's one where you have that cloud first approach, you're going to Azure, get off and exchange on-prem. But then we start dealing with like applications, when you get on the phone with a vendor, like, hey, buy our latest and greatest thing, but they may not actually need that. They're just, fine with their current one that may be 5 years old, especially when you're doing like laboratory manufacturing applications. Some of those legacy ones, it's just better to keep them going. So what do you guys find is like that balance between those two?
Yeah, I think that depends upon two things. One, is the end state of the organization, am I intaking the originating, let's just say that we're doing a merger, okay?
Yep.
So am I intaking the application into an existing application in the destination environment? Let's take HR, okay? So like HR scenarios, you might have two different completely disparate HR systems. It's an easy example where you're like picking one, right? And usually picking the destination one. So and even to do the M&A, you're like, you are loading your people into this HR system, and that is now the origination of the source of truth. So that's kind of where the decision is easy. Where the decision's less easy is kind of the things you were bringing up, is like, I've got an application over here, people need to still use it, and in order to continue to function, they need to use it in the new environment. That's one where you're typically like, and we won't go more into this because this is like later on, but like there's an approach for like, do you spin people over, how do I access that application once the people are moved?
Right.
Those tend not to be modernized in the move. They tend to be like their own projects in and of themselves. So unless there's like a destination thing I'm swinging people into, I tend to move the app along like as is.
We consider that kind of the data center work stream,
Right.
because that encapsulates servers, apps, and files versus collaboration that can usually move at any point during the project. Some of those I'd say just about all the M&As we do, that usually is the tail end, because there's so much due diligence and planning that has to go into that uplift.
If they're like on Exchange on-prem or like old as like home directories and stuff, those would be examples where you totally modernize. Like leave that stuff behind.
It's when you get the fun like SQL 03 running on server 03. It's a very security thing just to isolate that off, versus to actually like modernize it because your developer left 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's usually what we'll see with customers. They walk into those environments, and as part of that cybersecurity approach, walled off.
Oh, yeah.
Here's these two Windows XP machines can still talk to that 2000 server or Windows 7. And it's surprising how many of them still are out there. So, any other questions on kind of that overarching what, where, how, and why M&A? Otherwise, not, feel free to get up if you want to stretch. If you want to get a beverage, feel free to do so, or we can just dive right in. I'll take a vote. Dive right in. All right, unanimous. Let's go. So this is the fun part. Put on your seatbelts. We're gonna hit the pedal to the metal, and we're gonna start to look at. We're gonna take some of those concepts that Nathan talked about, overarching with an M&A, and then really start to dig into that planning and how we are starting to look at execution. So, nomenclature, we're going to cover what's in a name. We'll get into some of the licensing that we've seen with customers. The concept of a migration factory, that's going to be a big one that really will help to drive this whole process through to completion, and then the plan around that we'll cover within this section as well. So, we've got Oldco. You'll start to see these names throughout the slides. Oldco is going to be that one being acquired. SpinCo either be the one performing the acquisition or going into a new environment. And then NewCo, this was one that we talked about in kind of that fourth scenario that Nathan had, where you've got two companies of the same size that they're coming into one. It's not one really bigger than the other. We've got a brand new look and feel to really encapsulate what these two organizations do together. So wanted to set the stage a little bit with nomenclature and then talk about kind of what's in a name, right? And so this was really, as we look at some of those scenarios, we look at an acquisition occurring, usually that's driven through, as Nathan said, in boardrooms, in small discussions, and then once it starts to become commercialized, then IT gets involved, then marketing gets involved to help drive that announcement, press releases, and then start to talk about, what is that name going to be at the end of the day. These are the two really that we've seen, is you've got, Oldco adopting that SpinCo name. It's going to be easier because it already exists. If it's that company that's being acquired or being spun off, it's usually easier to keep something that's in place versus trying to come up with a brand new name. Even in some cases, there's a company we're talking to right now. They're spinning off of a larger parent company that is a holding company. They've got 100 other businesses. They're tired of each other because they both have their own requirements. They are both totally on board with an amicable split, but the company that's spinning off, I even told them multiple times, if you want to keep that domain name, if you want to keep that email address, you want to keep that login and move into a new tenant, there's going to be way more pain than if you were to use this opportunity to say, let's pick a brand new domain name, let's get a new EA in place. That's going to make for the easiest transition. And so usually those spin codes make it easier to really onboard those types of projects versus in probably the most complex scenarios is in these two organizations. They come together and they want to have this new face and this new branding by way of the effort, by way of the cost of the integrations. Those are going to be the most complex. So in kind of talking through those scenarios, really you've got that SpinCo acquisition is announced. You can see users are provisioned, from that old co environment into SpinCo, and usually that's just by way of setting up licensing. You know that you're buying this company, you have 300 users, they're going to get 300 licenses of Office 365. They're going to set it up in their domain. And in a lot of cases, you'll have people in like the C-suite and marketing that'll start using that name immediately because there are some real-term financial benefits for them to be able to start communicating under that new name. Or in some cases, as we look at that middle circle at the bottom, you can see that they want to be able to still send out as that old domain name for a period of time. You can do forwarding, or you can even do through some third-party tools, which we'll talk about, the ability to do rewriting on email, which typically involves a little more work from an email security perspective, DNS, DKIM, DMARC, SPF that has to take place. But to be able to still email out from, in some cases, what we've seen moving into this SpinCo environment, these users are in that environment, still need to send out as old co, and we can't rip out that old co domain name from that tenant for some time. So that's one that we're working through right now, trying to close the books on. But the benefit of this approach is you've got the user set up, you can forward that email to that old code address. You can use collaboration tools to start doing the synchronization and cut over from old code to SpinCo. And so it's part of that integration of collaboration. That's usually a first step. You can then see that realization of both organizations using the same Outlook calendar, the same teams, the same identity namespace, and working off of one tenant, usually with that collaboration step. We'll talk a little bit about the pros and cons of keeping collaboration and user computing together versus separate in a couple of slides. But typically, this is a very common approach. Lauren knows it very well. She's working on 4 of the 6 this year for one customer that are using this approach where they get the license and now here's your new email address, and then let's kind of go through that integration approach. So easiest, most common is this one here. The most complicated one, which is really that A and B coming into that new C company name without going through the process of spinning up a new tenant because they've realized that it's going to be more costly and it's going to take a lot longer. Still some of those initial steps of the acquisition, but then there's that discussion of, okay, whose name wins? And in this case, neither of them did. They wanted brand new branding, brand new face to their name. So they purchased that domain name. They go through and then they decide that they're going to update email addresses in the new company. So SpinCo really in this case and OldCo, they're coming together into one tenant, as we talked about in the previous session, and they decided that they're going to go into one tenant. So in that case, you've got this small contingent of users, or large contingent in this case, that you can start to give them that new domain name almost right away. There's a little effort that has to go on inside of their environment to be able to start consuming that name. But then you have the old code that's like, okay, well, we want to make sure that both companies start operating the same on the same day, but you're in 2 disparate environments. And so that's where things get a little complicated. We have to introduce third-party tools not only to bring in and synchronize those users from that old environment into the new AD, the SpinCo AD, and then those will end up getting provisioned either A at that point, or B, in this scenario that we have right now, they actually are, they're not even licensed yet. They haven't even purchased any new licenses. They've just been set up as mail contacts, which is completely supported by Microsoft too in this scenario, where as long as there's some sort of mail object that exists inside of this tenant, even if it's unlicensed, it can be used to forward email, and conversely with third-party tools, do domain email rewriting outbound as well. So all that has to be set up not only by changing email addresses in the SpinCo, setting up the tools against OldCo, and then that time comes where you make that decision of, okay, well now we are actually going to, on this date in March, we are going to go live this weekend with all of these users emailing out as that new domain name. So this is a very complex from orchestration perspective, both because you have two IT departments, two tenants, one tool set, working with them together to have this name. But it's actually becoming more common because it's giving both opportunities that chance to come and rebrand themselves without really digging into the weeds of those additional phases of moving collaboration, moving data centers, moving their PCs into a new environment. So for the customer they're working on with this right now, they're probably not even looking until, I'd say, July to start moving users' PCs and their collaboration experience into that NewCo environment or that SpinCo environment. But they've still been able to email and look and operate as the same for a good 4 to 6 months prior to that. So there's some flexibility in larger organizations for going down this approach. However, it is definitely probably one of the more complex.
You can see something that's really interesting about this versus the previous case is that what makes this so complicated, and you kind of mentioned this, what makes it so complicated is that you have two IT organizations but two tenants, and you're trying to allow them to interact with a new email address across two tenants on a day and have them not have the email go to spam and have it get to the right place and have the groups and the service accounts work and blah, 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 right? There's all of this has to work flawlessly on that one day. And the engineering that goes into making this work right, as we found, is very complicated versus the earlier case where sometimes after they just kind of suck in that organization, they pick a new name. Like we've had that use case, like they stuck with this name for a while, they brought it in, and then they decide to rebrand it once it's been moved. That's okay. That because you're now still operating on a one tenant, right? Like you're changing the email address on one tenant. We do that all the time, right? Makes this super complicated is that idea that like, okay, I've got two tenants and I need to make that work now.
And the other big caveat that just manifested itself in my mind from picking a new name is a 3-digit word, SCL, spam confidence level, because you have one day and you're drawing a line in the sand and those organizations start emailing out this new domain, there's no spam confidence built around that name. And now all of a sudden you've got 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people now starting to email this new domain, and it's going to start triggering things, and they have to build that confidence level. Usually it's a good 2 to 4 weeks plus on a brand new domain name before a lot of the mail systems will start to build that confidence. Even being inside of M365 and emailing to other M365 customers, that builds a little bit of time too. So that's a definitely something that you want to warn executives. I need to put that in as a slide at the end, see if I can take a note about that one to put that one in when choosing a new name that can bite you.
Another learning on this one, and you're going to bring up a diagram that's going to kind of make this real, but is understanding their mail flow.
Oh my gosh,
man! I feel like anytime we run into this scenario, getting the customer to really document how the hell mail comes in and out of the organization is gold. Because like we always find like what it goes through like this and this and this, like you're at go live, and at that moment you find out it goes through some stupid other appliance,
Yeah.
and you're like, and they don't, nobody knows how it works. There's no support. You're just like at the day, like trying to get on the phone with these people, like that mail flow issue is crazy.
Yeah, well, in this scenario, Spinco is EOP, and they had Defender Plan 1, so they already were in Microsoft. But now you have a third-party tool introduced. That third-party tool has to go to a Proofpoint instance, then to FireEye, and then to an on-prem Exchange server to hit a DLP instance, and then back up to their tenant. And then, as we started to pull back the layers of the onion on that one, we literally did cry. So.
I remember that weekend.
So yeah, that's one of the things as you're planning, understanding mail flow. If it's not simple 0365 to 0365, if there's some sort of regulatory requirements, there's some sort of systems in place, understand that ahead of time is very important.
I have a question on that two tenant scenario. Has concurrency been able to test out that external domain sharing where you can have one domain and two tenants yet, and how that functions?
With the Microsoft, we'll actually touch on that a little bit in one of the later sessions and kind of looking at what the Microsoft tooling scenario is. With one of our customers, they did talk to Microsoft about that, but in terms of looking at really just the concept of maturity and being able to have a tool set that you can support easily and actually be able to reach out to someone that knows how it works if there's an issue, is one of the reasons why we haven't really pushed any customers down that true Microsoft route just yet. And there's a number of caveats that I'll touch on, but that's a good one to mention. So thank you for bringing that up. I'm gonna take a note of that real quick. Those are two very good ones about mail flow and domain sharing.
I feel like that'll eventually be an option that we'll be more assertive on.
From a domain sharing perspective, definitely a much easier one, because then you can actually stamp that SMTP address in the other tenant too. So let's talk about licensing. So typically we'll talk about two different scenarios here. And this was that same customer we're talking about. So both customers have M365. So we'll just kind of set the foundation there. For Spinco, actually, I think in this case, it might have got the nomenclature a little bit wrong. So let me fix that real quick. Sorry, I've got way too many presentations up here. There we go. Let's fix this nomenclature discussion here real quick. So really, this would be Oldco, and then this would be Spinco. There we go. Let's get it right here. So Oldco has not only M365, but they have a lot of third-party tool sets. That was the scenario we just talked about with Proofpoint and FireEye and on-prem Exchange and third-party DLP. So that's in the old environment. And then Spinco, so they have M365 E3, and they have the Defender add-on for being able to have the anti-spam and all of the add-on capabilities. They have Defender. They don't have a developed DLP strategy, and they're using co-management. So in terms of the scenarios, what licenses will, again, I did not update that one. Sorry about that. What licenses will Spinco need to support Oldco users and devices? So something to think about. It's anyone want to try to take a stab at that just for fun?
EMS E3?
So in this case, they would still need to step up their license counts of what's in Spinco to match in Oldco. So let's just say Oldco has 3,000 licenses and Spinco has 4,000. In this scenario, we have to add on 4,000 E3s. We want to add on 4,000 of the the Defender for Office 365. And then really what kind of was the line in the sand was, what do they want to do for their DLP? In this scenario, they're actually still sticking with the third-party tool set. They're still using McAfee, and I cried over that one too, versus kind of going into M365, which kind of takes us back to using these opportunities to improve and modernize. In some cases, that's, when you start talking about DLP strategies, that can be a very long tail to a project if we were to try to tackle this as part of this. So that was a concession to say, okay, they'll keep that same tool set for that old device, that old owned device. They'll still have that tool set, but we'll use this opportunity to do a little bit of modernization since they have ConfigMan in the environment. So we'll use these opportunities. We've done a couple of projects like this where we bring devices into SpinCo and enhance their autopilot deployment, enhance their Intune configuration. So we can bring those devices into Intune. We've got a couple of scenarios we'll talk about in a second. But it will give that opportunity to make them cloud managed versus having to go through and blow them into ConfigMan and then take another step down the road. So
I don't know if you bring this up later, but it might be interesting to know when you need those licenses.
Correct. So in this scenario, we usually will only need the licenses when we start to onboard users in that tenant. So going back to the scenario that we had here, this was where we were able to suffice with having no licensing in the SpinCo tenant for all those users because they still are exercising their collaboration experience in their tenant. So they're still able to email out, even though they're using third-party tools to do domain rewrite through the new SpinCo tenant. We don't need to actually have a licensed user. We do need an AD object, but we don't need to have it as a licensed user just yet.
Do you guys do that cost comparison where, say, going up to an E5, well, it's more expensive, you get the entirety of that Microsoft suite there, versus having all those third-party add-on tools, because sometimes that can be cheaper than having all these other third-party things in there.
As part of doing kind of a planning engagement, as to look at the size and cost of a full M&A, we'll usually try to add that on as a value add to say, okay, well, you're E3 today, but then you've got all these other tool sets and you want to simplify and modernize. This is that opportunity to do so. So we try to when the opportunity arises itself.
Right.
So then and this is another scenario as well, that as we start to look at users that have moved into SpinCo, they've migrated. And I just really was. This was one of the first slides I built out. So there we go. So in this scenario, we had everyone moved into SpinCo, but this is that tail end where OldCo still had legacy applications in their AD or maybe even in their tenant. How many of you are familiar with a bridge agreement from Microsoft, a licensing bridge agreement? So for a period of time, Microsoft, if you have an EA and you're moving those licenses into another EA, as long as there's still 2 active EAs, I can have the count of licenses here be reflected in this tenant here for no additional cost. And Microsoft will do that anywhere from 90 days to 180. But if you're real special, in some cases, you can do it for a year, which we've just found out. But that allows you to do the migration, knowing that at the end of that period of time, that target or that SpinCo EA is really going to absorb that same cost. So Microsoft's not losing any money at the end of the day. You're still having to pay the licensing on both sides.
You made an interesting comment, Brian.
Right.
Yeah, when it was like, can you step them up to E5? Sometimes I think we've kind of seen differing results there. Like sometimes it's like they're already going that direction, so they're kind of bought into the idea of going E5 and modern and et cetera, and the step up is like intuitive to them. They would just go do it, right? But then other times, like it goes down this whole other zone. You've probably been involved in like just convincing a company by itself to go to E5 is its own journey, right? Taking that dependency when you're talking about the M&A transaction, if you find sometimes it ends up being like we just can't have that fight right now, or you can, but you have to like get leadership to like advance beyond some of the typical people that will fight it, like security, just they'll fight it because they don't know any better, and you'll run into those like blockers, right? So sometimes you kind of get the lay of the land. Like here's the table of people, here's the people I think will
cards on the
support it. And if you think that like I don't have the cards, then you kind of like say this is a good idea, but we're just gonna go fire on forward with what we got. Microsoft will be chasing that.
Right.
And one advantage is if you can make a good enough case for it, you can get some money to help support their M&A by them going to E5 and other efficiencies. But sometimes it just doesn't play that way.
We found out if a company is doing modernization and they're also adding on the Power BI piece of it, since that's including the licensing, once you start tacking on those add-ons, then it's much cheaper to do the E5.
What's the adage? 2 or 3 different products.
When you're adding like Teams Voice, domestic calling plans, all that stuff, and then you got that Power BI, it's then cheaper to go E5 versus all the add-ons.
Right. In some cases, we've been seeing it where organizations will have Office 365 and they won't have things like EMS. Then it's like, all right, well, there's automatically a license win from Microsoft, and then adding on those additional features.
You get that kickback as well.
That's right. Yep.
We just learned 2 caveats on licensing that I didn't see here. One is if you're transferring a tenant, you can only do it on the first day of the month. So if you have a mid-month close on M&A,
Yep.
you have to have an agreement with the other company in place that they can be the admin contact during that period. And then the other thing is Microsoft's deal desk is the one that approves these things.
That's right.
That's
Yep.
a special term we had to learn.
Yep, their deal desk handles a lot of that, and that's actually, I'll show this a little bit on the next slide to kind of do that comparison between the EA and the CSP, because that's where we're seeing a lot of customers really taking a step back and looking at their control, their licensing. And granted, yeah, you do get a cost with EA, but if you have a very fluctuating user scale across the year, then it almost can be a little bit easier just to manage it through a CSP a little bit quicker. And this scenario actually is very one to kind of bring CSP into. So in this case, that customer had the bridge agreement and that fell off, but they still needed to have a contingent of users in that old tenant. They still needed to keep that old tenant. They still needed to do SSO and Azure Active Directory Premium. So in this case, that bridge agreement ends, they still have several hundred P2s, Azure Active Directory P2s that they license through CSP in that case, because they know that that clock is ticking. It's going to be maybe 3-6 months, and then they'll be able to actually step that down every month. They've transitioned out of a catalog of 30 apps. Let's say they're doing 5 a month. One month you may need 500, next month 4, 3, 2, 1, and so you can control that cost a little bit more as well. So being able to move those licenses into those different agreements definitely give you some flexibility. So this is a fun one to kind of be able to have conversations with customers too. They might be the size to do an EA, but there's definitely some flexibility to be had with CSP. There's no commitments. You can go monthly, and you still get access to all of the same Microsoft licensing. And the thing that you can benefit from here is that concept of ramping up and ramping down. So, but you don't get that flexibility of being able to engage in a bridge agreement. So, in this case, being able to extend that EA into that other tenant for 90 to 180 days, knowing you're paying for it, has some value added to it as well. So those are usually some of the conversations we're having with customers as we look at, okay, what are you going to do with your name? What are you going to do with your email? How are you going to license? Those are some of the initial conversations. And then we really get into this concept of building that M&A factory. And so this is, as we've sat down and we've worked with customers, these are really those directional phases that we look at. And for customers that do a lot of M&As, really that phase 0 is kind of, as we like to put it, that t-shirt sizing, right? This could be a small, this could be an extra large. With a customer that's doing a lot of those, being able to size it and figure out what the right tools are, figure out what the right approach is. In some cases, they may be not using Microsoft today. They may be using something like G Suite for some of their collaboration. So that really comes into a lot of that t-shirt sizing. And then you can decide how you want to dig into that high-level planning. So, with one customer that I'm talking with right now, they want to spin off of a parent company, but they've already done this before, like 3 years ago. So some of the conversations of having a data center to manage, all their servers are in a work group already, and all their applications are already SaaS. So a lot of the complexities that you would normally see in that phase 3 have been removed from the equation. They're moving their data to third-party data storage because they are looking ahead for that SpinCo opportunity or that SpinCo engagement to happen where they can cut the ties. So that really does happen a lot within that spin up and kind of having those discussions on where we want to go. And then with any project, usually phases 1, phase 2 are pretty much a given. We are going to be sitting down and kind of looking at how we're going to build out the timeline. What is their architecture going to look like? What tools are they going to use for the migration? And then as part of that planning, within phase 2, then we do the deployment of the tools. We get into the weeds of who's moving on what day or what weekend and who's going to be impacted, and then how are we going to communicate to them, which we'll talk about in the next section. But then it's pretty much rinse and repeat with a lot of these projects. It's going to be email collaboration, and then it's going to be, in most cases, tying on the migration of their workstation too, just because there is inherently those complications. If I move my collaboration and my computer is still in 180 domain, and I still go keep doing SSO, and then now I'm working in all these collaboration applications, that experience is be a little bit different. Is definitely improved in the last 2 years with profiles in Office and in things like Edge to be able to work in both of those environments than it was in the past. But there still is that little bit of complication of a device being in that old environment. And then as part of that phase 1 planning, we'll look at this, and I think it's the next slide, when we start to tie on that planning of the data center, because there are some customers where they do that acquisition and they might be able to get a peek into their Office 365 environment. They might be able to see how many mailboxes they have and how much OneDrive they have. But until you can actually get in the weeds and look at, they may have 50 servers and they may have a number of applications installed on those servers and security groups, and just looking at how that spider web unravels of how you impact them on a day-to-day basis, or potentially could by moving their workstation. That's something you need to uncover as part of phase 1, so you can start to really transition that through phases 2 through 3 as part of planning and execution.
One thing that's not really noted here, but I think is important to call out, is that a lot of times that data center visibility around applications happens way back in phase 1.
Yeah.
We've had customers who are all I want to do right now is move email, and they're why are we even talking about servers right now? It's because that's going to be a thing, and also we need to access the applications from the migrated workstations of the users. I'm not just moving a person and their email over. Sometimes they just kind of understand the relationship between the workstation and the app. And sometimes that's not really a big deal because there's no real app authentication that happens between the endpoint and the app to actually use it, it's a AS400 or something. But sometimes it, surprisingly to them, does require that authentication to happen. And that testing has to happen way back in the phase 2 spot to make sure that migrated user can still use application 1, 2, or 3. And then by the time you get to phase 3, then what you're talking about is okay, now when I swing this app over, what am I doing? And that might be, as you said, that might be intaking it into something else. It might be moving the app as is. It might be some step of modernization as part of the conversion plan. Or it might be it's a SaaS application and they just need to swing over the identities. So that stage ends up being a really interesting spot in the conversion because it's probably the longest hanging around part of the whole thing.
And one thing that's not really surfaced here that's very important as well in a SpinCo or in an acquisition or a divestiture that really starts to happen in phase one is the network. Is, you know, one customer we're talking to right now, they want to divest and they're in the same building or in the same complex as the parent company, and they're using a lot of the parent company's network infrastructure. So they're going to have to figure out, okay, how much are we going to increase the pipe? You know, what switches do we need? How are we going to change the wireless? Is it going to be enterprise WPA? What kind of infrastructure is needed for that? So there's a long tail end that comes as part of the network that before we can sometimes even start on phase two. We can sync data between tenants with tools, but we can't really touch the workstations if they don't have a target environment to go into. Or even in a SpinCo scenario, they're staying on the same network, but they're going to be in another domain. So this whole management plane has to be accounted for before you can move that workstation, or you know, they may not be able to connect to the wireless in the exact same seat that they've been sitting in. The only difference that's changed is their computers in a different tenant or a different domain.
The other thing on here in phase 0 is the companies that do M&A a lot get really good at that spot. Like they know how to do the t-shirt sizing, and they know what the approach is that they follow for doing different sizes of integrations. Like this is 25 users or less. I'm not migrating anything. Like you get a new PC, I'm taking your data, I'm moving it over as needed, and you're done. Like whereas this other size, this is our approach to it, and you can kind of rinse and repeat the way you go to battle with each of these different sizes. And sometimes you hit the merger, and then you're like, well, bets are off. Like this is now a much more complicated conversation. But a lot of those smaller ones, it's like you get really good at that, and you can increase your velocity.
Absolutely. So we look at kind of that factory approach going into an M&A and setting it up. Some customers, it's build up the factory and really tear it down afterwards. In some cases, that factory is going to live on way past your engagement, and we see that a lot, to where you know that decommission of AD is kind of that last little tail end, or the removal of servers, or putting applications to bed. That's a piece that you know sometimes can take even after we finish a project, but we put that as part of that playbook to say, okay, when you get to the end, these are the items of considerations that happen in AD and tenants and tools, etc. And so looking at each of these integration work streams, I'm not going to go into the nitty gritty on each of these, but you know, as you can see within the data center, there is kind of that component of network that we talk about that really comes into play. And then if we were to really start to break this up into phases, so as we go in and we start looking at phases, usually it's going to be looking at cybersecurity, setting up identity, doing the planning across all the work streams, and in a lot of cases, depending on the customer's requirement, doing that mail routing change and setting up tools to be able to help support that mail routing plan. Once we determine what that plan looks like and then how we're going to move forward with migrations, then really that kind of that phase 2 and 3 of moving collab, moving end user compute happens together. And then towards the tail end, even though we've done all the planning for data center and applications, even though those moves might not happen for some time to come, we understand and we'll be expecting what will happen within those work streams. So then that way, as we execute in that phase 4, we know what is being moved, what has to be touched, and what data is being, what applications being migrated as well. And in some cases, you know, we have some network pieces of that phase 4 in place. However, we've maybe even started to implement some of those as part of phase 1. Usually, you know, as part of our scope of work, that's usually helping to give some guidance to those teams if it involves, you know, anything in the Microsoft space. But usually, you know, we'll see customers have, you know, third parties that can come in and do some of the cybersecurity components, third parties that come in and do the network pieces. But all these are happening concurrently as part of a single migration or integration program. So we like to show this one to customers to let them know that it's not simple, and it is a program, and there are all these moving pieces that are moving at the same time. So I make it look very linear and very waterfall, but in a lot of cases that is not what happens with these projects. So again, just to kind of bring into the work streams, how we kind of build out the plan and then really start to identify the effort within those work streams, that effort and how some of that change management occurs. We'll talk about in the next session. But this is with concurrency and kind of our approach, how we look at the discovery, how we build out the plan to say, what do we need to do now? What is coming very soon? And then what are we looking at long term, like apps, like data center that happens in that Horizon 3. This kind of comes as part of that plan. But then, kind of taking a step back to understand what to actually plan for, having insight into each of these different components. So technology-wise, we covered a lot in this slide. And as we start to look at the underlying pieces that support each of these work streams and start to do the discovery against them, we need to understand what could still be an AD. If there's any exchange on-prem or in the cloud, what servers are there? Data spaces, in a lot of cases, we see a lot of customers with SQL that has apps that are dependent on certain servers, but how do we understand those dependencies without an application catalog, which is usually one of the first things we really drive home as part of that planning is you need from day one to start thinking about that app catalog. And usually, we'll have a template we'll give to the customer to help drive them to do some discovery. We'll have some of our business analysts work with them to help coach them on how to uncover that information and build out that catalog. But some cases, if you're doing an acquisition, you may not have a resource on the other side that even knows. So, being able to have an overview into the on-prem landscape, the cloud landscape, as well as permissions. And that's the big one, users, groups, what's set on SQL servers, what's set on file stores, what's set on Windows servers. Being able to gain some of that insight, one of the tools that we use to help power that is, Quest has their enterprise reporter to be able to kind of go out and do some of that discovery to help you uncover things like, what's out in your domains in the groups, what data is out there. In some cases, as part of this modernization, this migration, it's also an opportunity to clean up. There's a lot of companies, especially, as you go and do acquisitions, there could be servers that have been sitting there for years just because they're sitting there. They may have no purpose. The data on there may have no value. So that's a decision that has to be drawn out, whether that server stays where it is, if the permissions get updated, or if it gets shut off. This becomes part of that discovery phase to be able to draw a line in the sand on what has to be done with those servers, that data, what can be excluded or included as part of migration. And then being able to have some of these comprehensive reports, being, even using the term a stranger to go on these environments, this helps really garner some of that familiarity with the data within not only on-premise, but also the tenant that's in that old co-environment. To be able to know, okay, this is what's there, and then we can start to plan where it's going to go within leveraging all of those different discovery data points that really do sit kind of right here, and being able to uncover those and look at reports and sit down and have those educated conversations are really important in being able to drive those next steps forward. So uncovering this data is the first step. And then, one thing that is really important too is we uncover the data, starting to put together a plan. If anyone's familiar with this look and view and works in this world, we use DevOps in our environment to collaborate with customers to build out, what work has to go into each of these work streams. And discovery is usually just the tip of the iceberg. Once that discovery is done, really then it's putting together the plan and understanding what tasks need to happen, not only in the old co-environment or the spin co-environment, but then us as technologists that are helping to guide these conversations, what effort do we need to have and visibility as well. So after we've gone through and done the discovery and had the conversations, then we start to put together a plan. And then sometimes with those plans, it's really having conversations, what decisions have to be made, and really guide a lot of these first phases where we can typically go in and sit and give a checklist or give a list of different decision points that need to be made. And then really it's going to be either company A, the old co, they're going to have to either fall in line with Spin Co, or in some cases, it's both those organizations having to sit down and have a conversation on what that end state looks like, because that could be an opportunity for change or modernization. So typically the first one that comes into mind is really kind of, what do we do from a tooling perspective? How do we get email out of this tenant and over into this tenant? How do we move this machine? How do we deal with mail flow? So we've used the Quest on-demand tool set. It's pretty easy. It's SaaS-based. In terms of being able to flip collaboration, it's agent-driven, and being able to flip a workstation, it's agent-driven, and that's all homed back to a console that we can drive from our end. And there's a lot of flexibility in terms of being able to really customize the migration experience. You don't really get that with Microsoft's native tools right now. They're very limited. They have a very specific use case. If you don't follow that use case, then you can't actually use them. And so, there's some limitations too. I'll talk about some of those limitations in 2 more sessions regarding tooling and how the actual migration process. But at a high level, the Quest tools do a lot of this, and it's definitely very powerful, and it's simplified our processes. As Nathan can attest, when we first did some of our migrations 6-7 years ago, we didn't have these tools, and being able to do some of these moves were very complex. And now it's just a matter of connecting 2 tenants, syncing it over, deploying some agents, and then going through and setting migration dates. I oversimplified it there. It's definitely not that simple, but at a 100,000 foot view out in space, that's how it looks.
I mean, it's important to note that like Quest is a tool set and a skill in and of itself, but it provides a tremendous set of tools that allow for very diverse sets of scenarios in these use cases. And that's why we tend to be picking it instead of using what the evolving new set of capabilities of multi-tenant integration is from Microsoft, which I'm really excited about them investing in. Because sometimes you feel like, why do I have to do this at all? Especially once they get to be cloud-only organizations. But the reality is that most of these organizations are not cloud-only. They have a lot of diverse tools, and this tends to give you the options necessary to hit those use cases.
Absolutely. And then kind of looking at with a typical project, this is if we were to look at really kind of the breakdown of licensing that we would use in one of these projects. So we've got some choices with information workers versus frontline workers. So with information workers, we do the full suite because it allows us to do everything from end to end, including the domain move function, which is actually a really nice tool set as well, to be able to pull a domain out of one tenant, move it to another. That's a piece that comes as part of that T5, along with all of the collaboration tools. With a frontline worker, in a lot of cases, we have a little more flexibility in not necessarily needing to do the orchestration of their computer moves, but we do need to still move their licensing. In some cases, we also need to do the domain rewrite. Those people still log into a kiosk type machine, and they still open up the web, and they still need to email out. And based off of that naming conversation that we had earlier, having those frontline workers email out the same domain name as part of that integration journey as the information workers is just as important. But the one piece that we can usually save in kind of stepping that licensing down is just collaboration and then the directory sync. And that's an important part of their tool set as well. They are, I don't know if it's gone to public, but I think they're in the process over the next couple of months of moving to more of a agentless type of migration so you don't necessarily have to go through and deploy your AD connects in both environment, and then the Quest tool sets, and then waiting for all the synchronization timing, which can be somewhere up to like 2 hours, because AD connect fires this time, and these usually are pretty quick, like within 5 minutes on Quest, but it's usually the Microsoft timing and replication that comes into play. But the AD connect piece, syncs all the objects, it syncs the SID history, it syncs the password, it syncs groups. And those are really important as we start to look to update ACLs in the target environment, even way ahead of moving things like file servers, app servers into the destination. So, you've got the on-demand migration licensing, you've got the enterprise reporter piece that does that full environment discovery. It is the most important, it's the most expensive part of the licensing tool set, but for that comprehensive look into the environment, it's definitely worth its value. And then there's two other ones at the bottom. So the Quest On Demand does actually migrate Teams chats, but it's only up to 30 days. So if you want to migrate someone's entire chat history inside of Teams past that, then there's an add-on license. And then this one at the bottom is actually very new. And actually, if you look at the SKU, it's MOD and then you've got MDO. So that threw me off a little bit as well. I had to go back to our Quest contact. I was like, did you give me the wrong one? He's like, no, the letters are flipped. But this is one that's going to have a lot of power long term. So I can move a hybrid AD join device in my source AD automatically into the cloud in the target. And then one thing that's coming to their private previews sometime this summer is if I've got a cloud-only join device in the source, I can move it to cloud-only in target too, without having to do the rebuild process. So that's a really cool add-on to their MDO, or on-demand migration AD suite. So along with doing the directory sync, that's the same piece that does the PC orchestration move as well. We'll go through a little bit of that later on. So I'm going to move through a couple of these quick, just due to timing. But in terms of planning, these are usually the questions we're asking customers. Do you want to do any sort of domain rewriting? Or are you okay just doing mail forwarding inside of the source environment over to the target while we're waiting for that cutover event to happen? And usually a lot of customers are pretty happy about that, where we prevent users in old code from being able to actually log into these mailboxes, but that mail is forwarded and then they can still email out using their existing domain name. And then there's usually a migration event where at that point in time, then they start emailing out as the new company. A lot of organizations, as they're going through this process, are usually pretty content with that versus the domain rewriting component of it and some of the complexity, because with some of these projects, they move on a pretty quick timeline, and so they can usually get migrated into the new collaboration experience pretty quickly, versus doing something like setting up the account, having them log into webmail, which we've seen in the past too. It's like, congratulations, you're now part of this organization. Here's your email, and at some point in the future, we'll integrate you. It's a very negative approach, and even though it's very low preparation, the end user impact is pretty high, and that just leaves a sour taste in their mouth, even before you get started with all of the hard work of the project. This is a typical SMTP integration flow. We talked about that scenario earlier where both SpinCo and OldCo wanted to email out as newco.com. This is typically what some of that integration effort would look like. So we'd have to pick one environment. Unfortunately, tool sets don't allow you to just pick a mysterious, you can't just home the domain name in Quest. You have to home it into a specific Office 365 tenant. So you have SpinCo that wins, you update all your emails there, and then you have that OldCo environment that they're going to be emailing out through your tenant for a period of time until that migration event occurs. And so we're synchronizing those objects. We have that connectivity, and then we have moved objects into SpinCo, and then using that object matching component within Quest, we can say user in old code as actually this mail contact in SpinCo. You email out through here, and then an email comes back in and forwards to their old code email address until that migration event occurs. When we cut over their collaboration, we cut over their computer, and we turn off forwarding, we turn off domain rewrite in that scenario. So then that begats the conversation of how do we handle collaboration in workstations. And so in terms of what gives the end user the best experience, you're going to want to move their workstation and collaboration at the same time. The caveat to that is impact. There's high preparation and there is some high end user impact, but then long term, the support is low because they've moved their authentication into that new domain or that spin domain. You have to do all the preparation. You have to make sure all their applications live in that new environment because usually there's a point in time of demarcation where you'll start provisioning users from old code with new SpinCo devices. This event hasn't stopped them from hiring people. It hasn't stopped them from onboarding or replacing devices. So you want to be sure that you're building those devices in that new environment as soon as possible versus having to, hire 100 people and do this migration event for those new hires when it's unnecessary. You want to be able to drop them right into that new AD, that new Office 365 environment. So there's quite a bit of upfront work that goes into understanding that app catalog and doing that packaging and what data they access and making sure the networks are ready for that collaboration move. But it's better than looking at kind of that longer refresh cycle, which we've seen with a number of customers too, where we move their collaboration immediately. And then at some point in the future, they'll either get a new workstation or their workstation will get rebuilt. And in some cases, that could be a pretty long tail to that as well.
I'd say this is one of the decisions that's the hardest for companies to make. Like they recognize the benefit of option one, but the timeline of the business pushes them toward option two. And you realize that you're kind of putting them in a non-optimal operating experience, especially as far as like OneDrive is concerned. It ends up feeling a little disjointed for the user, but it's better than having them work within webmail as a email collaboration option.
So usually this option there, they do a little bit of gnashing of teeth on this one. This one is really where they start weeping and ripping their clothes and not knowing what direction to go. This was one I mentioned, short-term gain versus long-term pain. There's really three options here. So the workstation replacement, you've gone through and you prepared that target environment, that SpinCo environment, and then the user just gets a new device that's already provisioned. And then essentially it's kind of that more, I'd say, natural progression into that environment for an end user. We're all used to getting replaced. We're all used to having our devices replaced. It's never a fun experience, but things like Intune and application deployment and OneDrive no folder redirections has made it easier over the last 4 years or so. So this becomes more of a natural segue for them into that new environment. So that's option one, usually the most recommended one. It makes it a little bit easier and it's more natural versus option two. You're keeping your device, you just got a new one, but we're going to autopilot reset it for you. Whenever you tell a user you're going to reset their device, it always comes with some hesitation, even from IT, understanding that there is that level of trust that person had their OneDrive is working, which there's consoles to verify that, but it's ensuring that they've actually kept their data somewhere that it's getting backed up to the cloud. So if you did do that reset, and one thing you can do in this scenario, you just drop the Windows provisioning package for the new tenant into the old device and reset it, and then it will come into that new tenant. Granted, there's a little bit of work that has to be done with the autopilot hardware hashes being moved around. This one is one that is supported by Microsoft, where if you were to work with MCS on a migration project, they use their tools, and this is the approach to get devices moved. So there is some high prep for this one to make sure that the data is backed up. There's a high user impact. And then, I said low long-term support. I'd say low medium is probably a little more accurate, just in case they call and maybe there's an app that's not packaged, or maybe they forgot some data. You have to be prepared for those conversations. But in a lot of cases, option three is kind of what we end up seeing customers go with. and going back to the do no harm concept, you can still impact someone, but when you go and you migrate their machine into a new environment, they'll still have icons in the same place. After this event, they will still be able to have that same look and feel. Functionality, that's another story, but at least they still have the same look and feel. And you still have that preparation up front at say in user impacts medium because they're still impacted, but then you never know what that long-term impact is going to be when you do a reackle and you move a computer between the domains. In a lot of cases, it's a non-event, so that's a medium long-term user supportability impact, but really here you're looking at, is that target environment ready for a device to be able to have connectivity back to their old resources? So option 3 is usually what we see customers doing. And so
I was just going to say,
for it.
I think this to a certain extent also understates that
The
option
effort.
3 is oftentimes a double move.
Yeah.
Like you're not only doing that complicated migration, but at some point you're going to replace that user's workstation. And then if you're trying to get to, we'll talk about the next slide, trying to get to like a different destination, you're then going to do it twice.
Yeah, you're trying to go to zero trust in Azure AD, then it
always like a unicorn dies an ugly death on option 3. Like I do kind of feel like there's an option between 1 and 2 at some point, which is like the incremental workstation replacement. Like you get a new device, you take the old one back, it gets cycled through the business sort of thing, which could be taken as well. But yeah, you're right. Like I'd say like 9 times out of 10 they've been going with option 3. But I think we've been getting, I don't know about you, but like my backbone's been getting stronger on option 1.
Our muscle, flex our muscle a little harder. To say, this is painful, you don't want to go down this route.
Develop the nervous tick when they pick 3.
Well, it's not like cost. They see the high upfront cost of
Oh,
buying all this capital, but then you hit them with the consulting hours are going to be more. Just buy more because we've done that hybrid between 1 and 2, and it's painful.
Yeah,
not as painful as 3, but
it's
still pretty painful. Here's brand new.
So, and then kind of as Nathan was saying, there's really that, okay, do we go to Azure AD join? This is usually the best opportunity as part of transformation to get them there, versus doing the hybrid AD join approach. In the hybrid AD approach, there's a whole litany of scripts and things that you have to run when you're doing option 3 to kind of get it there. Even if you're doing a replace of a device or you're doing a reset of a device into hybrid AD, you still have to think about, do we really want to eventually do that double move and get them into Azure AD join? Because then that's extra IT hours, that's extra cost, versus saying, we're going to take this opportunity to go take them from a traditionally hybrid AD join device, do a replacement or a reset, or in the cases where we have to do a join, we can use the Quest tools to move them from hybrid AD join into Azure AD join in the cloud. So these are all the discussions and the decisions that you have to sit down with the business to help them make, along with, as part of that transformation effort, these are usually where we're talking with customers that are still either SCCM managed, some level of co-management, maybe a CMG, and say, why do we want to move, acquire all these devices and then put them back into your legacy managed config man? Why not take this opportunity to take them right into Intune? You have to go through and put applications into config man anyways. You're still looking at all their policies and configuration, but usually in this scenario, when they have config man, it's because their autopilot process is not matured. So this gives an opportunity to sit down and say, okay, let's close that gap in your autopilot process and get all these machines moved right into autopilot into Azure AD join with all these apps that are packaged. And that usually at the outskirts of a project like this, then they're able to say, oh, we know the process. Now, any new machine we're going to do this way, and we're going to do it for the rest of our workforce. So it makes for a lot easier view at the other side of this project and how they can support the organization in being Azure AD joined and Intune managed. So then this is kind of what I like to show them in terms of what that desktop experience looks like if you were to go through and let's replace a device or reset a device within your current environment, and you're taking them through all these steps in this complicated process versus a much simpler uplift into the Azure cloud, into Azure AD Join, into Intune through Autopilot. So this usually will resonate with them as well from a simplification perspective of that process to get those new devices or to reset those devices and get them into their hands.
There's that one, going back to that statement, don't let a good M&A go to waste.
Yeah.
People are accustomed to having their PCs replaced. This is a time where they will accept it. So you all those option 1, option 2s, it's kind of like the good option and the bad option, or the worst option. And if you can get them to take that a little bit of upfront pain, the end game is so much better when you step through this.
So all of this really does culminate then in kind of discovery and sitting down and talking about, what are our options? What is the plan? Putting that plan together, sitting down in front of them, giving them, what this journey is going to look like. For smaller projects, this is kind of what we've usually seen from kind of a work pod perspective and a timeline. And even this is really aggressive. I mean, this is kind of going off the assumption of a very small data center, very few apps, but still understanding that there is that concept of they want to do some sort of domain integration. They may want to do rewrite. We still have to prepare their Intune environment and get them ready to have a mature Autopilot deployment process. We still have to get apps in. We still have to do testing, and then we still have to do those migrations. And even in this case, only having anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks for migration waves means that you're still doing some level of unit testing and pilot testing, in between that phase 2 and that phase 3 to ensure that you're going to be successful. Because even though I say this a lot, even though a lot of the technology is consistent across projects, the way everyone does it is unique. Every M&A process, even getting into organizations where we've helped them really build out that concept of a playbook, and I like to come to this one, even with that concept of a playbook, they're still going to make revisions to this with every M&A, and there's going to be different processes with how they handle that IT team and that integration with each project. So, we built a number of these for customers, so that way they have an end-to-end process. But even this, it requires someone to be knowledgeable of the process, knowledgeable of the tools to be able to execute. And so I'll share a little bit later kind of how we're looking to address that, but kind of looking at the whole integration concept at 10,000 feet. Again, oversimplified, but this is kind of how we look at it with customers, where we're doing the discovery and we're doing the domain rewrite process. We're doing the Intune enhancements and getting them ready to go through Autopilot and creating that runbook for them. So then in some cases, if they want us to work alongside with them through phase 3, great. If not, they've got the tools to be successful. And even in some cases, they will work with customers to do the first couple of waves, and then will be available for hypercare support to be able to help if anything, any abnormalities arise, to be able to escalate. And then we just start as part of that phase 3. If they're handling it, then we can work with others within the business to ensure apps and servers and files are migrated or ready to start migrating once those workstations are done. And in some cases, be able to move some of them while some of those waves are going. We try to minimize that because then we're over communicating to the end users. It's like, okay, well, you said you're going to migrate me, but you're moving this app and I have to log in with this browser and have to do this, and then your support desk just blows up. And then that keeping under the radar with a migration really starts to make some noise. So that was a lot in just planning. There's a lot that goes into that, and I know we've only got like an hour left, so I'll try to keep the next 2 ones a little short in terms of the session. Any questions? You want to take a 5-minute bio break?
Maybe this should have been an
get
8-hour session.
get out there. I mean, this could have been an 8-hour session.
Yeah, I know, we just flew through those.
Listen, I'm notorious. If any of you have been through my user group sessions before, everyone's like, the comments I've seen, I've heard the word fire hose more than once. So. Guess I really didn't need the camera on because I'm screen sharing.
Oh, yeah.
I'm gonna turn the camera off. There we go. So we're still screen sharing.
Also, you make the slides available at all?
So everyone will have their session posted to Sessionize. So it'll probably be by Monday. So there'll probably be some, as you sit through these, there's always a little bit of added value that comes through the conversation. We'll probably go in and I know just for 2 of them, I wanted to add some additional slides too.
on the bottom.
All right, so we're going to jump into the project success, or in a lot of organizations you hear about customer success and how organizational change management really plays a part into that. We're going to talk about three concepts here. We're going to talk about the concept of an integration management office that kind of oversees, within companies that do a lot of these M&As, that's really foundational on being able to drive a repeatable process, how organizational change management comes into play, and then business readiness. I'm going to move a little quick on some of these just based on time, and I want to save it for our next segment as well. But in terms of really integration management, we touched on a lot of these. It's discovery. It's two companies sitting down and agreeing on decisions, which we looked at that backlog. That was actually a live one from a project, and that was just a very small number of decisions that it has taken them in some cases weeks to not only decide on, but also do some of that implementation around. So, getting ahead of those is really important, and then kind of that execution and being able to kind of really build these out in phases. As you can see in the bottom, you've got that phase one of the discovery and the planning, and that phase two is really when you start to just really get into the execution. And looking at this is kind of from one of our customers that has that concept of an integration management office. This is really that overarching workflow of what IT integration looks like, from what happens day one to how do we get started within the first 30 days, establish security controls, start to build out those joint workshops, building out that integration plan and the dependency mapping. And then as we start to move into the top right, really we've fleshed out that integration plan. We scheduled those cutovers and that IT integration, which you can kind of see a lot of that through the workflow that's happening in the middle of the screen here. A lot of that success really is based on change management. It's, what are those change levers that occur in a successful integration management office? Having leadership alignment is a very big one. I know Nathan and I can attest where we've been in calls where that alignment just doesn't exist sometimes, and it takes a little bit of time to unfold. There's going to be topics that parties don't agree on that have to come together to make those decisions. And some of that really does kind of boil down to your stakeholder engagement, right? Your stakeholders and your leadership usually are the same people, but in some cases where the integration management really doesn't align to what the vision is from your stakeholders, that's where you have to be open and honest with them as part of those conversations as well. And throughout this, it's what is that employee experience going to be? It's going to make or break if people talk about that integration from years to come, or if they just remember, hey, we went through this process. We can look at the battle scars, and sometimes we forget where they are, but the ones that really went deep definitely stand out, and you'll tend to remember those. So, those are the ones that you want to try to avoid, where you have a great experience. And a lot of that comes through communication. It comes through training and looking at those two cultures. In a lot of cases, those two cultures may be very aligned, but it's rare. Usually the company that's being acquired and the company acquiring do have different cultures. And so being able to really meet in the middle is a very key piece of change management, is to see how those cultures work and be in tune to those as part of an integration process. And so, as we at Concurrency really look at these projects, we really do touch on, why change management's important. It's a lot of the design and planning. It's going through and doing the configuration and the go live process, but also after a wave has gone live, after a particular department or a site has gone live, it's being there to support them with any sort of hypercare activities. So those always arrive. There's always a rise in organizational change management, being able to communicate to users how to get in touch during, before, and after a project are very important as well. And so for this slide, I have a special guest presenter. I've got Lauren. Lauren is one of our senior project managers, and in kind of sitting down and talking about M&As, it's so funny how real this particular graphic is, because someone's concept of everything being fine to everyone else around is, you know, a catastrophe. And so I'm going to have Lauren kind of speak to some of the ones that we kind of sat down and saw that were things that, in M&A projects that went wrong. So fire away, Lauren.
Missed items in discovery. So, and all of these have been actual things that have happened in recent projects. So we were doing an M&A and we were actually migrating two different acquisitions. So one was G Suite to M365 and one was M365 to M365. And the G Suite, we were almost 3 months into the project, and maybe 5 days before we were trying to go live with pilots, they told us that they had a completely other tenant than M365 that we didn't know about. So we had to make sure that that was decommed prior to going through with the pilots.
It's always exciting finding things at the very last minute.
Yeah.
They do always pop up.
Defining the roles between any of the M&As and even us as the consultants. Same project. Again, people are getting acquired. People don't know if they're gonna have their jobs or what their new role will be. So some people at the current company are trying to almost fight for you can hear it in a meeting. They're trying to almost fight for their position and make sure that they're heard throughout the new people coming on. And then the new people coming on or merging are almost in a similar position, like, well, am I gonna get a role? Do I need to show myself? So you can feel the push and pull between everyone. And some of the times on a call, we're like, oh, they just need to hash it out internally, because to Chris and Nate's point earlier, that stakeholders are not in line on who's doing what role. So just the definition of that. Access levels. This can cause a huge delay. Some clients don't, most clients don't give global admin access, which sometimes is needed for certain things. And again, this was realized later on in the project. So to get the global admin access that we needed, I think there was like 1 of 3 people that we could go to at the time. And the project had already been a little bit delayed longer than we wanted it to. So to the picture, it's kind of to light a fire and be like, look, we need this access now, otherwise it's gonna delay the project another week. So just knowing who to go to, when to go to them, and making sure that they have the time. The migration tools. So we had a large user OneDrive. I think it ended up being 12 terabytes. And, refusal to remove, a lot of them are videos, but refusal to move any of the videos. So the Quest tool that we were using was not working properly. It kept timing out again, which delays the project. Just one user.
So we had to switch tools.
Yes.
So interesting how Metalogix, which is the on-prem tool to be able to move data, worked better than tenant to tenant. So I think Quest has improved some of that, but it just goes to show with looking at items, how that can impact migration as well.
User list. This is something that we are actively working on too.
Nobody knows who works at their company.
Seriously.
Yes,
It's
or
like
where
you
they
have
are.
no idea,
Exactly.
no one knows who
Yes.
works there.
So this is also dependent on how many waves you want. So if there's one big bang, that's easy. I don't say easy because nothing's really easy, but you could have one last hoorah before you go live with the big bang. Well, most of the projects that we do have waves. So the waves are ever changing because people are getting turned, people are getting added on. So we were done with one migration and someone like emailed and they're like, oh, when am I going? Because it was someone that was missed from the acquired company when they gave us the list. So that's a huge deal. And then that's why we have go live, no go or no go. Go or no goes to make sure that those people are not missed. Misalignment, again, we had this in one of our earlier projects. to Chris's point before, he had everything laid out in waterfall, and the project that I'm talking about was stuck out in my mind. They had a third-party vendor that was not easy to work with, and delayed the project, and we had to jump around quite a bit. Like, I think we were supposed to be doing, milestone 1, and it ended up switching it around, and we were on random things in milestone 3 just because we didn't want to delay the project any longer. So we were trying to make sure we made use of everyone's time and could still do items that could be done without this vendor.
Is this where we need like a graphic of a bus backing over the IT consultant?
Or a bus backing off a cliff.
Communication between the users, IT, and partners. Again, this really stood out with end users because the leadership just wants to get it done, get it done, get it done. So in one of our most recent projects, we had an end user helping out with the communications and also establishing who is going to be sending out comms to the users. But if you have an end user involved, they do have a lot to say, and that's a lot to take into consideration. So their definition of what needs to be communicated is almost never the same as what leadership wants to get communicated. They just want to do it and be done with it and meet that timeline. And the end user is like, no, this will affect us, with A, B, and C. The timelines, that's a huge thing. A lot of clients come in really aggressive because they're just doing what they've been told from higher ups. You got to make this work, and the higher ups don't know what is all included between the planning, the execution, hypercare, the comms, and you're working with multiple parties. I mean, it'd be easier if you just had 2 people working on it, because then you know who's in charge of what. And then also having people in different countries. A lot of people don't think about that. They have different PTOs, especially anyone in Europe. They
July and
have 2
August.
weeks of PTO compared
Go
to
out the
our
window.
1 day. So with their holidays. So just and that affects everything. That affects when you do the migration. That affects who's in the office and who can, make sure that they're available for the specific wave that had been set. So it also ties into like the wave planning and who goes and what time, depending on if they're in office or not even. So.
Who can push the buttons? We can push the buttons, but if there's any hypercare that needs to happen afterwards, and your team that's local is out on holiday, that kind of changes the schedule, which it certainly did.
This happens a lot when you're like planning initially with the IT team. And they're like, yeah, cool, 3 months, perfect, we'll do this. And then you, of course, like you tell them all the reasons they can't, but it's still like 3 months. It's what leadership wants to do. But then you get into it, and they don't back that up with their own backbone, right? They're like, no, okay, so let's move it here and there, and that's where the project extends, and everybody gets upset, and et cetera, et cetera. Knowing that in front, pretty important.
So these are all good things to keep in mind when you start thinking about project success and change management. These are all different metrics to really gauge how things are going, things to think about before they happen, some of that pre-flight, to where looking at change management, you can really start to drive home different components. Really is breaking down how you communicate to users, how you communicate to IT, how you communicate to leadership in the business are very important as part of those campaigns. In a lot of cases, when you start with change management, what we've seen with M&A is usually it starts with marketing, because marketing is the one that controls the message that goes out to the business, that goes out to the world that this change is happening. And so, we've seen some really good marketing teams, and we've seen some really lackluster ones that you kind of question, why did they send this, and why did they even message things the right way? So that's really where, as you start to talk about the change that's happening, where interfacing with the business is very critical to get ahead of it and be able to give them these, this kind of overview around what that impact's going to be, what that process looks like, how we want the communication to go, and what technically or even sometimes non-technically goes in those communications, and then backing that all up with training is important as well. And so, this is an example of working through M&A is what we've kind of looked at from a high level change management plan that's really successful, kind of going out and talking about the culture change, looking at the communication strategy, how we engage stakeholders, what that change impact is going to look like, the communication plan, the training plan, finding those champions, the change agents. You would be surprised how many or how little customers we go into where we say, who are your champions? They have no clue. It's like, okay, have you done a big project before? Yeah. Do you have friends of IT? Yeah. Okay, those are the people we want to bring on board as our champions because they know how to handle change, and they know that if you're walking them through this process, they're going to be open and honest with you if something's wrong, versus being very closed off and then finding out months later that, oh, this person or this team did a horrible job when you never had the information that something was wrong from them. So having change agents, having champions is very critical to the success of these projects, especially right ahead of actually doing some of those migrations, because then that can drive your change management plan. That can drive how you have some of these communications structured and what information gets included. So when you have things like accessing applications or accessing files, those change agents can give you that data to say, okay, well, I've moved and this didn't work, and we worked with the project team and made this correction, and so now maybe this extra step needs to be added to access an application, or just this little piece of communication needs to go out to them. Can help really drive that success in engaging your community and leveraging that change plan and be able to drive that success. And so then that starts to really dovetail into the business readiness part. So after discovery, after planning, really setting that support model is very vital. And then in a combined work stream model, which we're kind of talking about, where we're moving email and workstation and sometimes applications and sometimes data, those are all, you would consider that like a program, a migration program. We look at these as combined work streams because of so many pieces. We have to make sure that the business is aware of what's happening, what IT is doing, and how it intersects with end users. And so being able to clearly communicate the when, how, and why to the end users will make things go a whole lot smoother. And so this is where we start to look at some of these awareness plans where we know that a change is coming. We're doing preparation. The team that's overseeing the integration is sending out these communications. They are identifying change champions. They're getting the business readiness prepared. They're doing town halls. So then as we're doing those migration waves by site or by company or by department, we have a clearly defined expectation set for them. We are providing hypercare after, and then we're also looking at lessons learned, because with any project, it's always evolving. There's always going to be something that happens within a migration that you're like, okay, if we make this one little change, we can either optimize or make the end user experience better. So then as we start to look at an end user engagement timeline, we understand what as IT we have to do for pre-work, but also are able to institute that as part of the communication plan. And yes, there's a lot of different intersections of communication that's introduced to the user by way of presentations, which could be through town halls, through emails, or maybe even a document, because we all know that it probably takes maybe even 5 or 10 times to reach out to a user to let them know that something is happening. And so that's something that we recognize, and we've got plans on how we're going to address that with future migrations that we'll touch on the tail end of this presentation. But finding ways to be more effective to communicate to users. It's either over communicate or get smarter. And we've got a lot of tools at our disposal to be smarter. So starting to leverage those, and we'll make these even easier. As we start looking at how we initially communicate to the business on this change, really there's two different facets of it. There's old co, which are the users that are being integrated. convey to them technically, what's happening behind the scenes to make things better, what that timeline is before, for them actually performing that integration, as well as what steps are going to occur. Now, probably not going into the weeds, but really a high level, kind of like, as we saw here for being able to do some of these integrations. That's probably at a really high level from awareness perspective that we would communicate to our end users. And in some cases, I'd say actually probably in a lot of cases, we have applications, how they access them, how they access old file shares, how they access applications using their old credentials after migration through like incognito modes or different browser profiles. But at the end, really, it's trying to be positive about the change. Changes, humans are not creatures of change, as it's been put. But if you're able to positively convey the benefits of it and generate that through how you communicate in that excitement and being clear and concise, it goes a long way, even without actually having done the execution. How you set up that messaging is very vital as well, not only to Oldco, but also to Spinco, to everyone within the company that is existing, and letting them know things are changing. People are coming on board. They're not integrated, but then here's the plan for them to be integrated. So everyone's on the same page, not just people in Oldco. It's across both organizations as well. And then, as we've looked at successful migrations, that T-minus countdown is one that happens a lot. Here there are certain things that happen during those T-minus countdowns by way of communications and documents and town halls and emails to let them know that at that T-0 point in time, this migration is going to happen, or they need to go and they need to open this app to migrate over their collaboration experience, or their computer is going to go through this reset process, or it's going to be moved into a new domain, or they're getting a new device. But communicating that experience all along the way is very important. And here's one example, that we've kind of put together as kind of a quick little flow chart just to let people know that, hey, from this perspective of email, this was one of the projects they're working right now where they're still on their old codomain, but they have they're getting a Spinco email. It's going to get forwarded through the domain rewrite process, but then at some point in the future, they're going to have to log into their computer with those new credentials. They're going to have to go set up MFA. They're going to have to set their password for their first time. And then when that computer experience or that computer migration event experience happens, they're going to need to know, okay, they will still probably have both credentials for a period of time, but here's when you use this, and here's when you use that. And then support. This is one that we've leveraged with customers as well to let the IT teams and leadership know, how are we supporting or helping you support your customers throughout this process. A lot of it is, they're going to call in and they're going to open up a ticket. They're going to talk to someone. And then at what point would an escalation lead, or maybe even a partner like concurrency, engage to help them remediate an issue? And so having a clearly defined support strategy is important before you engage, to communicate to your teams and then understand as calls come in who to be able to reach out to, because those inevitably happen.
I don't think that one can be understated. Like, this is where we've seen some initial parts of the migration go poorly, is where we have where the organization has not had a tier 1 structure set up to capture those initial known errors, deal with them, and then a process to create new known errors that team is trained on and can respond to. And they start going immediately to the project team, and that screws with all the rest of the things the project team's trying to get done, or even is counterproductive to the project team. We've even found that on go lives, having separate bridges between the tier 1 support, there you have tier 1 support, you got the bridge for helping tier 1 support, then you got the actual project team. You need to segment these groups to allow them to be productive, or they're just going to turn into one big mess of a lot of people talking and not a lot of work getting done. Lauren, you probably have more experiences on that.
Yeah, so as consultants, we should really not be known to the end user. And in the recent project, to Nate's point, you're getting sent tier 1 support issues because they didn't have a plan in place. And we had tried asking them about it, so then we had, delay the project. We'd have a separate meeting to talk about what their process was gonna be, how it was gonna be, when to escalate to us if needed, and who was gonna be taking on the tier 1 support.
There's nothing wrong with drawing a line in the sand, but as long as you have a clearly defined plan of who does what, and that kind of goes back to the slide that Lauren had spoke on of what could go wrong, kind of delineating who does what. There's nothing wrong with saying, this is your responsibility up to this level, and if it gets in over your head, then kind of contact us, but be prepared to back that up with information. More times than not, I know I've been pulled into calls where I have no clue. It's just a fire drill, and they didn't even know what was going on. They just had a customer say there was an issue. It's like, okay, well, once you have the facts and you've done some due diligence, usually we'll have a KB document that they can go through of known issues. Then let's talk about it. Is that an opportunity where it's learning and training that needs to happen, or is this really truly something within Windows or maybe even the migration process that there's some sort of defect that needs to be resolved as we go into?
Pretty quickly, you can have issues escalate during these transactions that aren't actually issues. Like red alert, everybody get on a bridge. It's just like, you didn't investigate this enough. This is minor. It's not even business impacting. It's just one user. That's, I think, a big thing that would be learning for us.
This is fine.
Yeah, this is fine.
Any questions about if there are none about kind of the OCM, let's talk about tooling. And I think we touched on this a little bit earlier in terms of being able to do the migration. What can Microsoft do and can't do today? What are some capabilities that we love to leverage, through third parties? And then what does that orchestration process really look like? And so, each organization kind of approaches this differently. And so, really what you want to do day one is you definitely want to have that calendar sharing and that secure mail flow and start planning for provisioning and licensing users. I have seen in the past where they'll go through and they'll create a whole bunch of guest accounts or contacts in Exchange Online for users in old co, and it's like, don't do that, because we start that planning now. We use the third-party tools to synchronize users and set up contacts. Then you're setting the foundation for the future and not having to do double work. That's been one thing that's bit us with some of these M&As is, we'll be brought in too late, and then there'll be double work or cleanup, and then we have to start over in certain areas. So that's why having that plan and that t-shirt sizing and that playbook really comes into play from day one. And so then we start looking at tools. There are some things today within the Microsoft space that they can do. Just leave it at that. There's some things that SharePoint Migrator, aka the legacy mover, can do. It can move from on-prem and other platforms. Can't actually move from SharePoint Online to SharePoint Online, which is painful. It can move from on-prem to the cloud. The Exchange cross-tenant, it can move fast, but there are caveats. And just like Exchange, with the OneDrive, you have to have an EA, and you have to actually add on a add-on. So it's almost like buying a third-party license to move data across different tenants. You have to actually contact Microsoft to be able to do those OneDrive moves. I don't think they've changed that just yet. It would ramp up this use quite significantly if they made this easier.
Do you know calling Microsoft and trying to get extended timeouts when you're using migration tools and like the service accounts you're using to connect to try to help that they don't flag that account as like a denial of service and you end up getting throttled? Or
No, usually with like Quest, for example, it's doing like Graph API calls, and so it's just doing it with the permissions across the tenant, like with an app registration versus it doing. And there's actually I'd have to go find it, but Quest actually has a document of all the different permissions that they do as part of their registrations inside of a tenant when you go through and you do the setup. So it's not necessarily a service account unless you start to get into, I think, tools like a MetaLogix or other migration tools that you do have to do a provisioning of a user, but most of them are app registrations now.
Yeah.
To your point with throttling, yes,
I was just
that's a
thinking, like,
danger.
the data throughput, right? Not
Yeah.
necessarily the communication.
Oh, sure. So like being able to like throttling.
Where you get throttled by Microsoft, where it's like, hey, I'm
Yep.
only allowing so many active connections, right? Even though that you're doing a lot of them
Yeah, and
in the past, right, would do that blob.
And so that's
migration.
one of the things that, Mike, that, I just want to jump ahead of this one, that Quest has actually implemented. So they have done a lot of improvements on their platform to be able to do some of the priority throttling. And so this is actually new too, within the last few months, is you can actually set up your priority level migration. So if you've got a group of users that you want to ensure that they're synchronized ahead of lower priority users, even if they might be in the same migration wave, you can kind of batch them. And a lot of the tools that they've inside of the ODM suite that do some of that data copying, they've improved, like being able to understand like where it's hitting that threshold so it doesn't hit the throttling on a SharePoint side.
Yeah.
That was a comment I made earlier, is one of the partner calls I was on last week, they had said that even within the last couple of months, migration that was taking 28 hours, they've been able to get it down to 8 hours and still be able to fall underneath of the exact same site and data. They do these tests, 8 times a month to be able to look at the speed of their product against Microsoft and make sure that it doesn't hit those throttling limits, and they've seen significant improvements. So that's part of it too, is looking at the tool set and how it can move data. Another improvement they've made as well is within their email migration. So it behaves more like MRS does. So one of the things previously with Quest is, what happens if you synchronize data from source to target, and then someone's in the target and they clean up the target and doesn't sync over from the source, that change, that someone may have cleaned up inside of that mailbox. So that's something that they've improved as well to make it more like MRS. So if people do a lot of cleanup prior to that final cutover, it's reflective. So that's been one of the struggles. And that's even the SharePoint migrator tool set. I've got a lot of customers where they'll do the OneDrive sync to be able to move off of file shares up into the cloud, to get rid of home drives. And that's one thing that tool lacks. So if I've cleaned up my F drive and I've synced all of that data with the Microsoft tool set, that data that was deleted on-prem is still in the cloud. And so that's one thing that Quest is doing to make sure with their tools is, if something is cleaned up, it's reflected in the cloud as well. If something's moved, it's reflected in that location as well. And the ODM tool is actually super easy to set up. It's literally, once you're licensed, you set up connection to the 2 tenants, you edit the consents to where it has that full ability to access each of the different Microsoft features, and then it has the ability to do account discovery, matching, and then synchronization, and then you're ready to do the cutover. So all that's orchestrated within one pane of glass. With the project that Lauren's working on, where they've got 6 different M&As, each M&A is actually its own project. So while you're connecting multiple tenants into one organization in Quest, you can set up multiple projects as well.
Is it pretty common to find guest accounts, especially for like the C-suite, where they're already doing some collaboration even before they're choosing to actually do purchases or whatever? So it's like you end up having to boot those out in order to create a correct relationship, whether it's contact.
Yeah, you're having to go in and clear out that contact so that way it can actually be set up properly. I've seen that as well too for the target organization. Yeah, it's not too uncommon to see those contacts. I think we had to do this with our most recent M&A. We told them, it's like, well, you don't need these contacts anymore because now you have a mail user that's forwarding that email. So you just have that object in your directory, and then it gets routed to wherever their mailbox is instead of having to manage the 2. And then usually through the ODM AD and the synchronization, it's able to create those contact records from day one. And then when it comes time to actually do the migration, it will actually convert it from a contact to actual mailbox, just by way of the attribute changes on-prem, since most people still have hybrid environments and on-prem AD. I've got to manage those exchange attributes on-prem. It's one of my Christmas wish lists from Microsoft where I don't have to do that. It's been on there for a couple of years. So we talked about some of the features in the collaboration tool sets. This kind of goes back to short-term pain, long-term gain in terms of doing the migration of workstations, and why we try to avoid this, because as you can see, each one of these steps down in the bottom left corner is actually a PowerShell task inside of the Quest toolset. So to simplify the migration process of machines from domain to domain, there's still that T-7 effort that we have to do, which gets that user ready, that does offline domain join caching of their credentials on their machine. Because most users nowadays, and unfortunately in this scenario, the customer didn't want to go to full Azure AD join, they still wanted to go to traditional hybrid AD join. A lot of those users are off-site, they're remote users, and to transition a machine between domains to where you don't have to have a VPN in place is very tricky and almost impossible. So there's certain steps that have to be orchestrated not only before the migration starts, but also during the migration to do a lot of that cleanup. There's tasks like group policies and MDM removal, and then we have to do after the MDM removal, then we have to do the enrollment after the machine has been migrated. There's a lot that goes into that initializing step before we actually do this concept of the big bang migration. As you can see here, I think I can zoom in a little bit. Yeah, here, let me zoom in real quick. So as part of the day of migration, so there's time of migration, and there's one task that would actually do everything at once, which is problematic in itself. So usually what we've done traditionally is we'll do each of these steps and make sure that they finish successfully before we roll to the next one, versus trying to lump everything together. But this is one of the reasons why you don't want to do a hybrid AD to hybrid AD migration, because you have to take all this into account and pray that it works right. And I'll say that a lot of times it does, after you've gone through and done the validation and testing within that environment to know what some of the caveats are. But that's really the trick here, is testing. You have to make sure you know everything about how that machine build goes and what to expect in the target environment, and orchestrate it down to a T, so that way you can execute these. The nice thing about the ODM AD, though, is it does allow you to do it without deploying anything on-prem. It's really just an agent that runs over the internet and checks in with Quest, and it can actually do this orchestration. So this is typically the purview that we're used to viewing, from our engineers on our side and looking at doing the migrations. Is we're going through and making sure each of these steps complete successfully, and we're monitoring somewhere in the ballpark of like 50 to 200 machines in just this one pane of glass, and praying that after a critical step of machine reboot happens, that it checks back in online. There's nothing worse than being 75% the way through PC migration, and then it falls off the list. And then you have to coordinate with someone on site, or pray that the machine didn't go sideways, which does happen too on older boxes that I've seen, that all these stressful processes on older boxes will cause them to just stop working. It does happen. So always having spares on hand is another tip, especially in the manufacturing environments where they run those machines for 5-7 years, and all of a sudden you're running all these tasks and you're resetting permissions in Windows, and then it just stops working. It does happen. And so that's one of the nice things with the ODM AD, and which was their acquisition of the binary tree product. So this is actually the on-prem, but it's the same under the hood. It's just that the agent checks into the cloud versus the server on-prem. But then we can go in here and start to do some troubleshooting and look at all the different steps under the hood to get the computer moved over into the new world. And then usually all that can happen without user interaction. But this is typically that one step that we do need to have a user run this tool and log in with their credentials, so that way it can switch over their profile, their licensing, change their OneDrive and their Teams, which at this moment does not support the new Teams. It will not support switching of the new Teams profile. That's something you have to do manually. But the nice thing is with this, you can pre-deploy it on a machine, so then that way it pops up automatically as a user logs in, or you can send it through a queue and email. So that way they just click on a button and it allows you to launch an executable that switches over all of their desktop experience. So that covers really the tool set component of the migration. Questions from
How do you handle, like, if you're moving from hybrid, right, which is basically you have a domain that you can connect to, and you're moving to Azure only, but how do the app connectivity, right? I'm Azure only, and I'm not really a member of that domain. How's that happening?
So there's a couple of pieces that usually have in play. You know, the network connectivity is the important one, whether it's through VPN concentrators, private lines, or just a VPN client. So getting the VPN switched can be cumbersome too. I've even had customers where they both have global protect, but they're on different versions. So you have to almost pray that the versioning works, and sometimes you're switching VPN clients, which is the nice thing about having a tool set run from the cloud, because then you kind of have that third management vector that's not SCCM or Intune as you're transitioning them, that can still send commands to that device to be able to manage it. So that's one piece, connectivity. For Azure AD join, usually what I found is add a DNS suffix onto the machine. So it has the same DNS suffix as your AD, and you can push that through Intune. So traditionally, it would be like work group. So you can actually push the DNS suffix that even though the machine is in work group, it has a DNS suffix of domain.com. And then you also through Intune would push your DNS search suffix order to that machine as well. So that way it can have that ability to know kind of what names to search for and to what DNS records. So that helps it behave a little.
Just receive a prompt basically for a user, like
app
that is still in domain, the workstation isn't domain joined, right? Then they over VPN, they make a connection to that app.
Depending on how that application authenticates, if it's like Kerberos and NTLM, it should still do some of that SSO, because that's still the same credential that we had synchronized over. So there's a lot of that can happen behind the scenes as well with the app permissions. So inside the application, some of them are nice being able to honor multiple directories. A lot of applications don't. So usually it's a conversation of educating your users that this application, now you're going to get this additional prompt, or you have to access it this way, or letting them know that you're going to have a little bit of short-term pain while we migrate that application into Azure or into a target data center. So that's why app catalog is important, and knowing who your personas of that access that app, and being able to say, okay, these 20 people access this app, so maybe we'll move them a little bit later while we figure out the strategy of moving that application because of how that application performs. So, but just at a pure NT level, hybrid AD or Azure AD join works just fine. There are some tricks that you can throw at it with the DNS suffix on the machine and with some search suffix orders that'll make it behave like it was still traditional Active Directory joined.
Okay.
And we've seen that with some success with
so
customers.
It just tries the UPN that it has. It's
It
the
tries,
UPN matches.
it assumes that server is at domain.com, and by feeding it that DNS suffix, then it feeds it, makes it think that it's still in domain.com, even though it's in a work group. That one's I don't know where I picked that one up. It was a couple of years ago. I think it was like the last time I was here speaking or at a session here, and I was talking with, actually it was Paul. It used to be at Edmonton. He was asking that question. I was like, yeah, I just have to run across this. And sure enough, that worked. So no, that's always a tricky one. And trying to get people comfortable with the fact that machines are still going to work if they're not domain joined with a domain. And there's a lot of really good blogs about it that speak to why that's almost like it's not true that you have to have machines domain joined in some of those, unless it's just a really old app. And sometimes that's the case, or it doesn't handle authentication using Kerberos or NTLM the way it was supposed to.
That has been one of the biggest like misinformations around Cloud PC only, is like that it doesn't work with on-premise file shares, that it doesn't work with on-premise apps. Like, we've been moving like some pretty sizable organizations to Cloud PC only and haven't really been blocked by inability to communicate with applications or use on-premise domain functions, or it's really kind of like a misinformation you need to clarify with people rather than a real
Even
thing.
if you're doing like Windows Flow for Business logins, right, where you're not really grabbing the password, right? So that's a different mechanism.
It's still under the hood, that same credential that you're, in a lot of cases, customers are still syncing their user accounts from Active Directory using AD Connect. So it's still that credential underneath the hood and it's still able to pass a lot of those same tokens.
Okay.
If you do like K-list after on a Azure AD joined machine logged in through Hello, you still have all those K-list records against your tenant. So, and then it should be able to pass that same one back to Active Directory. So
just that the machine isn't authenticating, right? Like the user's authenticating.
I think once you do that authentication, then it should be able to have that same Kerberos ticket.
Yeah, the Cloud PC gives you the
one from on-prem, or from your Active Directory.
Yeah, that you get a ticket, granting ticket to be able to get a Kerberos token.
Yep. Without having to do that additional authentication.
Correct.
Yep.
Yeah. You don't have to have connectivity to the domain controller at login.
No. Not with Azure AD join, I don't believe.
Yeah.
It could be based on each application. It could be a little bit different.
Yeah, and if the app isn't configured correctly, right, it's going to fall apart.
The biggest one, the biggest misnomer was around like file shares, right? So if I VPN into a network and then now I'm going to access a file share, would I be prompted to do authentication? And that's a no as well, because you already have that ticket.
Yeah.
So as long as applications behave the same way, then you should be successful. But no, that's one that we've had a lot of conversations with the customers. It's like, test it out, but 9 times out of 10, you won't have any authentication problems appear. So, good question. So we've got 2 more segments, and we should be done in 10 minutes. So just a couple of slides to touch on really about transparency and issue resolution. And really, we kind of touched on it previously with the change management slide that Lauren had. This actually would be a good one for this session, just to kind of be upfront and be prepared. But that one's more of preparedness. This one's more what happens when things don't go right. And this is where you set that expectation with leadership that do you want it done fast or do you want it done right? Can't tell you how many times we've had to have that conversation with customers because a lot of times they have hard set deadlines, but if we're brought in weeks before that deadline, or they have a small budget, or they're misaligned expectations, that's where we have to go in and tell them, you can't have both. You can't have it done fast or right unless you want to throw a lot of money at it, which they don't, or they want to throw more people at it, which usually they don't have the resources, because a lot of times constraints are based on the customer. It's not that us as consultants don't have the manpower to help staff a engagement. It's we don't have the line of sight to people with the knowledge or the technology to be able to change some things in their environment, or they don't have the money to be able to support it. So going in with that from day one when we talk with them is something that we've been more mindful of, more that backbone to be able to tell them in order for projects to be successful. One of the projects that we've used as an example several times throughout this particular presentation regarding one example here why we tried to warn them with a very limited timeline and not being flexible on it, how that's dangerous is, from this example that old co and spin co is new co, sending out with one domain name. They wanted to understand like how that would have an impact, and with a very limited timeline, it's hard to be able to kind of convey what things could be relayed or which could be dependent on their email, especially when you start to look at applications, things like a new domain name holding up messages, looking at any sort of third-party email flow that's in the mix. That kind of slowed things down a little bit too, kind of getting into the weeds and figuring out they had an Exchange server that was having a lot of queuing going on because of a third-party DLP. So that was something that took weeks, if not months, to kind of uncover and get to the right person. So, they wanted to have us move quickly, so we didn't have time to understand that impact until we started to get into the fray. So understanding the environment's important on a very quick timeline. It's almost impossible. And a quick timeline doesn't give us sufficient time to be able to communicate the impact of the change. So, while we can communicate to users that they're going to be emailing out as their new domain name, they're still going to be opening up all their apps and going in all their SSO with that old co domain name in the old co environment. And SpinCo would then still be logging in as SpinCo until their UPNs change. So a lot of change and a little time to communicate it and give the end users that ability to absorb it is dangerous as well. Because that will lead to their support desk blowing up. They'll ask us why they have so many calls from their end users, and then the person that looks like the bad guy because we didn't warn them up front would be us. So, and then ultimately, without having that runway to effectively help them digest the change and communicate the change, it leaves that bad taste in the user's mouth as well as the leadership's mouth. And so then going into the other phases of the project, you're on rocky ground because you didn't set that expectation up front. So being as upfront and almost a naysayer and being a Debbie Downer is almost, it looks and sounds bad, but at the end of the day, you want them to reflect back and say, okay, they warned us and we took it slower and we had a better experience versus us not saying anything, having a bad experience and having a single project customer.
Yeah, using this using the this is going to be easy talk track is like the absolute worst thing you can do here. Like everything that Chris just said.
Like I said at the very beginning, at the very beginning of this presentation, this is one of the most complex projects you'll do in IT. So conveying that and that it's going to take time and rushing is dangerous is problematic. And the best thing you can do as well, in not underselling the effort, is being open with leadership and really telling them that it is a large uplift. It can take time. In a lot of these integration projects, we've seen them take 12, 18 months based on the size of organizations to do it right. So rushing it is not important. It's not a good thing to try to do with the complexity of some of these projects and cost. When you start breaking down licensing and integration time, to see it be $500 to $1,500 per user is not uncommon, and that could even be on the light end if you've got a really complex application environment. And considering that this is taking into account that IT still has a day job that they have to do, and then they're being pulled into all these meetings and doing all this additional work, and that we have the expectations on them, that puts wear and tear on them even more so than normal. Questions? So being open with leadership is kind of one of the more important ones. And so really kind of as we start to look at how things in the future can be easier. We talked about change management, tools and orchestration, planning. As we've engaged as concurrency in a number of these projects, one of the efforts that we've undertaken this year is to try to see how we can make, even just starting as something as simple as wave planning and putting some data in the hands of our customers, and then putting some better tools in the hands of our employees, what can make that easier. One of the things that we have kind of started to build out as a tool, we call it Automator, because this is really the pain of every migration. And Brian, earlier I saw you cover your face because of something like this. And Teresa came in the right point.
Oh, you have my picture.
Yeah, this is your favorite slide.
You should have that one with the guys.
Right. Yeah. Oh, Charlie from Always Sunny with everything on the board. That would be a great one. So yeah, this is something we recognize as kind of the pain of every migration. And then, it's list management, right? Because things change and you're having to rely on different people and being connected with those people to give you the right information. So, we put together a tool that really resides, in Azure. It resides in Power Apps and runs off of a Power BI platform that pushes data from customer environments, both on-prem and in their tenant, into a SQL data source. And then we use that tool to be able to help with some wave planning exercises. So that way we collect Azure AD, Exchange, OneDrive, and then in the future, we're going to be adding in SharePoint Teams and computers as well.
Don't forget about HR too.
Right, and HR as well. So that way we've got all these data sources to help us be able to take a look at, running a Power BI report. And I'm going to stop presenting right now. I don't want that in the presentation. But let me go back over. Sorry, I need to find the right Teams window. Kind of wanted to show you what this looks like in the real world. So we've kind of built out this Power BI dashboard to be able to look at our migration waves and pull in all this data from our data sources. Aaron and Eli and our team have done an awesome job in being able to pull this together. But essentially, we can kind of look at all this data to be able to do some planning around, okay, here's a manager. If I wanted to kind of sort it based off of a department, I can do that as well. And then I can see how much data is in each of these mailboxes, as well as being able to go over into OneDrive to be able to say, okay, how much data is here? Am I going to run into an issue where I have a OneDrive that's over 12 terabytes and be able to plan around that? And then we've actually added a couple of other really cool pieces of information here too, like what users have been created in the last 14 days to make sure that they've been added in. And then from the first time that we ran this project to now, what users have been terminated, so that way we're not trying to add them into a migration wave. But we have these concepts of waves. Where's that? There we go. Here's the migration waves that our team has built into the tool. And then we actually will give the customer access to, here we go. So we'll actually give the customer access to this particular tool as well. So that way they can come in here and do account management. So that way they have all the tools at their disposal to be able to add a user into a wave. So then we can take that data in those waves and pump it into Quest and start migrations, start syncing data between the different tenants. The next item that we are working on in terms of possibilities being endless is once we're able to map a user to a computer, then we'll know what wave they're in. We can start to send them communications, just let them know when their wave is happening. We can send them Teams notices, so Teams chats. We can automate Teams chats to let them know that their migration's coming. And then we can even start to leverage things like Intune to be able to send pop-ups on their devices as well. So that way we have multiple vectors to let them know that a migration is coming. and then be able to actually come in here the tool to use things like logic apps and schedule those migrations and have them run. And the only time we really have to get involved is if there's an error. But then we can start to look at this wave status to know, have they been matched? Is there a target UPN that they've been matched to? Have they been synced? Are they ready to migrate? Is the migration running? Have they been migrated? So being able to have a single pane of glass for being able to manage this is kind of where our direction is going from an M&A perspective, to be able to run these a lot more effectively as well. So it's been quite a project that Teresa and I have been running this year, and I've got a couple of really good developers that have kind of helped us bring this to life. So
Think of it this way, this concurrency automator that we have built, it touches everyone in the project. The executive on the can go see a dashboard to see where things are at. The project manager can go see a list. The client can go and update people. So we have real-time updating, and nobody is having multiple sources of truth. We have a single authoritative list, and your developer can go and grab the lists from the authoritative section and know that they're grabbing the correct things. Your BA can schedule the communication. So when we were looking at creating this, we had a lot of people from every role taking part in this, so it isn't just one person's. Okay, you got me on my soapbox.
Oh no, that was great.
You have me at automate, Teresa.
Yeah. Any final questions? Otherwise, really appreciate you being here. Check on Sessionize early next week to get a copy of the deck, and please be sure to fill out the survey and let them know what you thought of the session. Let them know that you stopped drowning from the fire hose, and it's great information. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Yes,
Thank you. Lunch is ready.
Oh, yeah.
Oh. Wow.
There's a lot of it, guys.
Lunch is.
Walk down the list, there's salads with sandwiches, there's vegetarian, there's chicken, there's bop and blop and blop, and there's sandwiches. Don't worry, there's food. Thank you,
Thanks
guys.
again.